Clean that up. I told you to clean it up, Calvin Brooks snapped. Why are you still standing there? He snatched a dirty rag from the edge of a nearby table and threw it onto the wet tile floor in front of Annie, right near the counter. A few minutes earlier, a customer had accidentally knocked over a glass of water while reaching too quickly for a napkin. The water spread across the black and white tile, forming a clear, uneven, slippery puddle. Annie stepped back carefully, making sure the water did not touch her shoes. She held her job application folder tightly against her chest. "Sir," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "I came here to apply for a job. I'm not an employee here yet." Behind the cash register, Margaret Ellis, a waitress with silver hair pinned in a low bun at the nape of her neck, froze with a stack of menus in her hands. Calvin stared at Annie as though her answer had offended him. "You came here looking for a job, didn't you?" he said. "Then prove you can be useful." Annie looked down at the rag on the floor. It was an old cleaning rag, darkened by coffee stains and crumbs, the kind used to wipe grease from tabletops. He had not handed it to her. He had thrown it down, as if it belonged on the floor, and as if she did too. Margaret quickly set the menus down and stepped out from behind the counter. "I'll clean it up, Mr. Brooks. It will only take a moment." She bent down to pick up the rag, but Calvin stepped in front of her. "No," he said. Margaret stopped. Calvin pointed at Annie. "She can do it." Margaret's voice grew smaller. "She only came in to ask about the part-time position, and I'm showing her what the work looks like." Annie held her breath. She pressed the folder against her chest, the edge of the papers digging into her sweater as if that thin stack of resumes could somehow hold her together. "But I didn't spill the water," she said, her voice quiet and tense. "I didn't even touch the glass." Calvin narrowed his eyes. Instead of answering, he kicked the dirty rag with the toe of his shoe. It slid across the tile and stopped just in front of Annie's feet, the edge of the cloth beginning to soak up the water. "Pick it up," he said, "then clean the floor." Annie stared at him. "You came here asking for work," Calvin continued. "So this is your chance to prove to me whether you belong in this place." "I brought my resume," Annie said. "I thought there would be an interview." "This is the interview." The man who had spilled the water pushed his chair back. He was middle-aged, wearing a blue polo shirt, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir," he said, stepping toward the counter, "I'm the one who spilled it. Let me clean it up. This young woman had nothing to do with it." Calvin turned to him with a forced smile. "I appreciate that, sir, but I have it under control." "No, you don't need to do that," the man said, glancing at Annie. "You're making her stand there as if she did something wrong." "She didn't do anything wrong. I spilled it. Let me clean it." A woman sitting 2 tables away, wearing a light-colored cardigan and reading glasses on a chain, set her napkin beside her plate. "He's right," she said. "That girl did nothing wrong." The man beside her nodded. "Miss, if you need a job, I know the manager at Palmetto Books. They're hiring part-time. You don't have to stand here and take this." The woman added gently, "There are kinder places than this, sweetheart." Annie looked at them, surprised by their kindness and ashamed that the kindness made her want to cry. Calvin's face darkened. "That's enough," he said. The woman in the cardigan lifted her chin. "From what I can see, it isn't enough." Calvin ignored her and stared at Annie again. "This is my restaurant. Under this roof, I give the orders. Anyone who works here listens to me." "I don't work here," Annie said softly. "Then you can start earning that right." She shook her head. "Not like this." Calvin stepped closer. "What did you just say?" Annie felt her heart pounding in her throat. She had been ready to wipe tables. She had been ready to sweep floors. She had been ready to work hard, but this was not work. This was a test designed for her to fail unless she agreed to lower herself. "I said, not like this," she repeated. "If I'm hired, I'll work hard. I'll show up on time. I'll do things the right way, but I will not clean up something I didn't spill, just because you want to prove that I know how to obey." Margaret whispered, "Honey, maybe you should go." Calvin gave a small laugh and glanced around the room. "That's a lot of pride for someone who came in here begging for a paycheck." "I'm not begging," Annie said. "I'm applying. Looking the way you did when you walked in here. There isn't much difference." The words hurt more than Annie wanted to admit. She knew exactly what he meant. The old coat, the worn shoes, the belief that having less made a person worth less. At a table near the window, Evelyn Parker, a retired teacher with silver hair and a cup of tea growing cold in front of her, slowly picked up her phone. She did not raise it high. She simply tilted the screen toward the counter, her thumb trembling slightly over the record button. At the kitchen window, Jamal Price stepped a little farther out. "Mr. Brooks, let me clean it up. The lunch rush is about to start." Calvin snapped his head toward him. "Get back in the kitchen. The floor is wet," Jamal said. "Someone could slip." "Then she should hurry." Jamal's hands clenched once, then fell back to his sides. Annie carefully placed her folder on the counter. She smoothed the front cover once with her fingertips, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of dignity before letting it go. "My name is Annie Whitmore," she said. "I came here to apply for a part-time job. If you don't want to interview me, you can say so. But I will not pick up that rag, just so you can prove something." Calvin stared at the folder. "Whitmore?" he said, his mouth twisting into a smirk. "Is that supposed to mean something?" "No," Annie said. "It's just my name." He picked up the folder, opened it, and looked at her resume for less than a second. Then he tore the page in half. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. The man in the blue polo stepped forward, anger flashing across his face. "Hold on," he said. "You don't get to tear up her papers just because I spilled a glass of water. I told you it was my fault. If anyone needs to clean it, I will." Calvin did not even look at him. He dropped the torn pieces onto the counter. "There," he said to Annie. "The interview is over. Now clean the floor, or walk out." Annie stared at the torn paper. She had printed that resume at home that morning and carried it on the bus as if it mattered. Her first resume. Her first attempt to stand on her own without needing her foster father's name to open doors for her. A sharp, burning ache rose in her chest. She felt wronged in a way she could not fully explain. Her eyes stung, but she forced the tears down until her throat hurt. She would not give Calvin the satisfaction of watching them fall. Then the bell above the front door rang. A man in a dark suit stepped inside. His graying hair was neatly combed, and his face was so calm it revealed almost nothing. He stopped just inside the doorway and took in the entire room. The water on the floor, the dirty rag, the torn resume, Margaret's pale face, Jamal standing silently near the kitchen window, Calvin's chin lifted in defiance, the phone in Evelyn's hand, and Annie, standing there with her arms hanging at her sides, trying not to fall apart. Richard Whitmore looked at his daughter. Annie looked back at him. Calvin Brooks noticed the suit before he noticed the man wearing it. That was how Calvin judged people. Shoes first, watch second, jacket third. Only after he had examined those things did he decide how much respect the person in front of him deserved. Calvin's expression changed immediately. The hardness around his mouth softened. His shoulders relaxed. A familiar professional smile quickly appeared. "Good afternoon, sir," Calvin said, stepping forward. "Welcome to Harbor Light Grill. I apologize for this minor inconvenience. We've had a small issue, but nothing to worry about." Richard Whitmore did not answer right away. His eyes moved from Calvin to Annie, then stopped on the dirty rag lying on the wet tile floor. "Just a small issue?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Calvin smiled politely and smoothed his tie. "You know how things can be in a restaurant. We have a new applicant here." He gestured toward Annie without even looking at her. She got a little confused near the counter, and now we're just trying to get everything back in order. Nothing serious. Annie lifted her head. The man in the blue polo stepped forward. "That's not true," he said. Calvin's smile stiffened, but he kept his face turned toward Richard. "Sir, please. I've already said I'll handle this." "No," the man said louder. "I'm the one who spilled the water. She never touched the glass." Calvin glanced at Richard with an embarrassed expression, the kind a manager wears when pretending to protect a well-dressed customer from troublesome people. "I'm sorry you had to witness this," Calvin said. "The lunch hour can get a little chaotic. Sometimes people misunderstand very basic instructions." Richard looked directly at him. "Basic instructions?" Calvin nodded quickly. "Exactly. Here, everyone has to be willing to help. That's how a restaurant works. This young woman said she wanted a job, so I gave her a simple task. But instead of cooperating, she made a scene." Annie felt those words hurt more than the dirty rag ever could. He was not only lying, he was arranging the lie carefully, making it sound reasonable, making her look difficult and ungrateful. "I didn't make a scene," she said. Calvin did not turn to look at her. "That tone is exactly what I mean." Richard's eyes rested on Annie for only a moment. He still did not call her by name. Annie understood why. But standing there, while he continued to act like a stranger, made her chest feel heavy. Calvin gestured toward a table near the window. "Let me seat you, sir. Coffee or sweet tea? The shrimp and grits are excellent today. The first drink is on the house." As an apology for the inconvenience, Richard did not move. "Do you often offer free coffee after humiliating job applicants?" Calvin blinked. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "You said she was an applicant." "Yes, sir. And you also said she spilled the water." Calvin's eyes flicked quickly toward the man in the polo, then back to Richard. "There seems to be some confusion here." "There's no confusion," the man in the polo said. "I spilled it." "I've said that 3 times. The woman in the light-colored cardigan leaned forward. "We all saw it." The girl walked in politely. "That gentleman spilled the water, and you threw the rag down in front of her," her husband added, "and tore up her papers." Calvin's smile disappeared for half a second. Then he quickly recovered his composure and looked at Richard with tense eyes. "People these days love getting involved in things that aren't their business," Calvin said. "Phones are always ready, and everyone wants to turn everything into a spectacle. I run a clean establishment. I have standards." Richard looked up at the words painted above the counter. "Hospitality is our tradition," he read. Calvin brightened, thinking he had found common ground. "Exactly. This restaurant has served families in Charleston for decades. We take pride in order, courtesy, and proper presentation. People come here because they know what to expect." "So she lacked proper presentation?" Richard asked. Calvin hesitated. "Sir?" Richard nodded slightly toward Annie. "She came to apply for a job." "What exactly made her unqualified before you interviewed her?" Calvin cleared his throat. "It isn't just one thing. People in this business can tell who truly understands service. By looking at their clothes?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Annie's fingers tightened into her palms. She had come to Harbor Light with a folder and a folded bus schedule in her pocket. She had prepared herself for a difficult manager, a short interview, maybe even a rejection. But she had not expected to stand in the middle of this room, listening to a man build a false story about her while strangers had to pull the lie apart piece by piece. Jamal stepped out from the kitchen doorway. "Mr. Brooks, let me clean it up before someone slips." Calvin snapped his head around. "Get back in the kitchen. It'll only take 30 seconds. I said get in the kitchen." Richard watched Jamal stop. He watched Margaret lower her head. He watched Annie swallow the words she wanted to say. And in that moment, he understood that the real management system at Harbor Light Grill was not found in the schedules, the menu, or the service standards. It was fear. At table 6, Evelyn Parker kept her phone steady. Calvin noticed and pointed directly at her. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to put that phone away. You are not allowed to record inside my restaurant." Evelyn's voice was calm. "I taught school for 38 years. I know very well when a grown man is trying to change the story before the bell rings." Calvin's face reddened. "This is private property. And that young woman's dignity is her private property too," Evelyn said. "You just trampled on it." Richard looked at Evelyn. "Did you record what happened?" "Yes, sir," she replied. Calvin slapped his hand lightly on the counter, trying to appear calm instead of panicked. "That's enough. I will not let my dining room become a courtroom just because one girl walked in here demanding special treatment." Annie spoke before she could stop herself. "I never asked for special treatment." Calvin turned to her. "You asked for a job. I asked for an application, and I gave you a chance to show humility." "No," Annie said. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "You gave me a dirty rag." Richard's expression did not change, but his eyes grew colder. Calvin turned back to him, making one final attempt to hold on to his polished manner. "Sir, I apologize once again. Let me take you to another table, away from all this. Some people simply don't understand how business works." Richard stepped closer to the counter. "A business that needs cruelty to make a point has already failed." Calvin's smile froze. "With all due respect, sir, you don't know anything about running this place." Richard looked at the dirty rag, then at the torn resume. "I know enough." Calvin exhaled sharply through his nose. "This place has been here for decades. I've kept it running through recessions, storms, staff shortages, bad reviews, tourists who don't tip, and employees who act like showing up is a favor. So unless you came here to eat, I suggest you let me do my job." Richard did not answer. Calvin mistook the silence for victory. He lifted his chin and pointed at Annie again. "As for her, she can either clean the floor or leave." That is her choice. The man in the blue polo shook his head. You're still doing this? She came here to work, Calvin said. Work begins with knowing how to listen. The woman in the cardigan spoke. No, work begins with respect. Calvin ignored her. Annie looked at the torn resume on the counter. A small piece had fallen near the puddle and stuck to the wet tile. Her name was split across the torn edge. Annie was on one piece. Whitmore was on the other. If this moment touched your heart, please give this video a like. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because Annie's story reminds us that dignity should never depend on money, power, or a last name. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about courage, truth, and justice. Richard saw it too. He took out his phone. Annie saw the movement and knew the moment had arrived. Richard tapped a name and raised the phone to his ear. His voice remained low and calm. Claire, Harbor Light Grill, right now. He ended the call and put the phone away. Calvin gave a strained laugh. Calling someone to complain? Richard looked at him. No, he said. I am showing respect to my team by giving them a chance to be present before I make a decision. Calvin stared at him. For the first time, uncertainty appeared clearly on his face. Your team? He asked. Richard still did not answer. He only looked at Annie, then back at the man who still believed the restaurant belonged to him. Calvin kept his eyes on Richard, waiting for an explanation that did not come. The silence bothered him. It was one thing for customers to complain. It was another for a well-dressed stranger to stand in the middle of his dining room, make one short phone call, and then look at him as if the whole building had already changed hands. Calvin forced a laugh. Your team. That's a good one. Richard did not smile. Annie saw the shift in Calvin's face, the first small crack. He was still proud, still angry, but something else had entered now. Doubt. It showed in the way his hand moved to his tie, then dropped, as if he did not want anyone to notice he needed to steady himself. Margaret noticed. So did Jamal. Evelyn's phone remained angled toward the counter, quiet and patient. The water continued to spread across the tile. It carried one small torn piece of Annie's resume toward the table leg nearest the counter. Her name was still visible on it, the ink blurring along one edge. The man in the blue golf shirt bent to pick it up. Calvin snapped. Leave that alone. The man straightened slowly. It's her paper. It's trash now. Annie flinched before she could stop herself. Richard saw it. He took one step toward the counter. Do not call it trash. Calvin turned back to him. Sir, I have been polite with you. No, Richard said. You have been polite to my suit. That sentence made the room still. Calvin's mouth opened, then closed. He looked Richard over again, but this time the calculation was less certain. Richard continued, voice low enough that people leaned in to hear. When you thought I was a paying customer, you offered me coffee. When you looked at her, you offered her a dirty rag. That is not hospitality. That is a confession. Calvin's face reddened. I won't be lectured in my own place. Then stop giving lessons in cruelty. The woman in the pale cardigan whispered, Lord have mercy, under her breath. Annie wanted to say something, but her throat was tight. She had come here to prove she could stand on her own. Now her father stood only a few feet away, and still she felt caught between relief and shame. Relief because someone with power had finally seen. Shame because she had wanted him to see her succeed. Not this. Calvin pointed toward the door. If this is going to turn into a public performance, she can leave. I don't need the trouble. The man in the golf shirt stepped between Annie and the puddle. I already told you. I made the mess. If anybody leaves, it shouldn't be her. Calvin glared at him. You want to manage the place? No, the man said. I just know the difference between a spill and bullying. That word landed hard. Bullying. It was plain. Too plain for Calvin to twist. Margaret's hands moved to the edge of the counter. She had worked at Harbor Light long enough to know where every coffee mug belonged, which customers wanted lemon with their tea, which floorboards creaked near the back hall. She also knew which employees Calvin scheduled poorly after they questioned him, which applicants he dismissed before looking at their forms, which delivery drivers he made wait outside in August heat. For years, she had told herself she was surviving. Her husband had died with hospital bills still arriving 6 months after the funeral. Her knees hurt after double shifts. At 62, Finding new work would not be easy, so she smiled when Calvin wanted her to smile, stayed quiet when he wanted silence, and went home tired enough to forget what courage felt like. But Annie's torn resume sat on the counter like an accusation. Margaret cleared her throat. "Mr. Brooks." Calvin did not look at her. "Not now. She didn't do anything wrong." His head turned slowly. Margaret's voice shook, but she did not stop. She came in polite. "I heard her. She asked about the part-time job. That gentleman spilled the water. You know that." Calvin stared as if she had slapped him. "Margaret," he said, soft and dangerous. "You should think carefully." "I am," she said. Her eyes shone, but her voice grew steadier, maybe for the first time in too long. A few customers shifted in their seats. One older man took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Another woman lowered her fork and stared at the tablecloth, ashamed of her own silence. Jamal stepped out fully from the kitchen now, wiping his hands on a clean towel. "She's right." Calvin's face tightened. "Back. In. The kitchen." "No." The word came out quiet, but everyone heard it. Calvin's eyes widened. "What did you say?" Jamal looked once at Annie, then at the rag. "I said no. I'm not going back there and pretending I didn't see this." "You want to lose your job over a stranger?" Jamal swallowed. "I've got a daughter about her age. If somebody treated my child like that, I'd pray someone in the room had the backbone I didn't have for the last 10 minutes. The room went silent in a different way now. Not frozen, listening. Calvin's control was slipping. He could feel it, and because he could feel it, he reached for the only weapon he trusted. Fear. "You walk out of that kitchen one more step," he told Jamal. "Don't bother clocking in tomorrow." Jamal's face changed. He had bills. Everyone in that room could see it. His pride did not pay rent. His daughter's braces did not care about dignity. A man could be brave and still afraid of Monday morning. Richard watched him closely. Then Richard said, "Mr. Price, is it?" Jamal looked over, surprised. "Yes, sir." "You came out because you saw something wrong?" "Yes, sir." "Then stay where you are." Calvin gave a sharp laugh. "You don't get to give orders to my kitchen staff." Richard looked at him, noted. That one word carried something Calvin did not like. Outside, a car door closed. Then another. The sound came through the front windows, faint but clear. Calvin looked toward the street before he could stop himself. Annie heard footsteps on the sidewalk. Margaret heard them too. Her shoulders lifted as if she were bracing for weather. Calvin's confidence wavered, then snapped back in a different form, anger. He turned toward Annie again, perhaps because she was still the easiest target. "All of this," he said, pointing around the dining room, "because you couldn't pick up a rag." Annie's eyes burned, but she held his gaze. "No, all of this because you threw it." The man in the blue golf shirt nodded once. "That's right." The woman in the cardigan said, "Exactly right." Evelyn's phone captured it all. The rag on the tile, the torn paper, Calvin's flushed face, Annie standing straighter than she felt. Calvin stepped closer to Annie. Richard moved at the same time, only half a step, but it was enough. Calvin stopped. For the first time, he looked between them with real suspicion. "You two know each other?" he asked. Annie's breath caught. Richard answered before she had to. "That is not the question you should be worried about." The bell over the front door rang. A woman in a navy blazer entered first, followed by two people carrying slim leather folders. She was in her 40s, composed, with the look of someone who did not hurry, because people usually waited for her. Her eyes went first to Richard, then to the room, then to the rag on the floor. Calvin's face changed the moment he saw her. He knew her, not well, but enough. He had seen her 4 days earlier in a closed meeting about the transition. Claire Donovan, Regional Operations Director for Whitmore Hospitality. She had sat across from him with a legal pad, asking clean, direct questions about staffing, vendor contracts, complaints, and customer experience. Calvin had smiled through that meeting. He had called her ma'am. He had assured her Harbor Light had strong values and loyal employees. Now Claire stood in his dining room, looking at a dirty rag lying in front of a young woman's shoes. "Mr. Whitmore," Claire said, walking straight past Calvin. "We came as soon as we received your call." The restaurant went so quiet that the ice machine in the back sounded loud. Calvin's lips parted. "Mr. Whitmore." The name moved through the room without anyone repeating it. Margaret closed her eyes for 1 second. Jamal looked from Richard to Annie. Evelyn's phone stayed still, but her mouth opened slightly. Calvin tried to recover. "Claire," he said, stepping forward too quickly. "There's been a misunderstanding. I was just handling a difficult applicant, and this gentleman here." Claire turned to him. "Do not interrupt." The words hit him like a locked door. Richard had not moved. His face was calm, but Annie knew that calm. She had seen it when lawyers tried to slip language past him, when executives lied with polished smiles, when men underestimated him and realized too late they had mistaken restraint for weakness. Claire came to stand beside him. Richard looked at Calvin. "My name is Richard Whitmore," he said. "Whitmore Hospitality finalized the purchase of Harbor Light Grill and its related properties this week." Calvin's color drained. Richard continued, each word even. "I came today to see how this restaurant treated people when nobody warned you I was coming." Calvin swallowed. "Mr. Whitmore, I didn't know." "No," Richard said. "You didn't." Then Richard turned slightly toward Annie. For the first time since he entered, he let the room see the truth in his eyes. "And the young woman you just humiliated," he said, "is my daughter." No one moved. The sentence did not explode. It settled. Heavy. Final. Impossible to sweep away. Calvin looked at Annie as if she had changed shape in front of him. The old jacket, the worn shoes, the folder, the torn resume, all of it rearranged itself in his mind. Not into guilt. Not yet. Into fear. Annie felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She wished, for 1 second, that the floor would open, not because she was ashamed of being Richard's daughter, but because now everyone understood the part she had tried to leave outside. The name, the money, the protection. Richard seemed to feel that too. He did not reach for her. He did not make her smaller by comforting her in front of the man who had tried to break her. Instead, he looked back at Calvin. "If you had known who she was," Richard said, "you would have smiled, offered her a chair, and called her ma'am." Calvin's mouth worked, but nothing came out. Richard's voice stayed quiet. "That is the problem." Calvin Brooks looked at Annie as if the floor had dropped beneath him. A minute earlier, she had been a girl in a faded jacket, someone he could order around without consequence. Now she was Richard Whitmore's daughter. The same girl, the same shoes, the same steady eyes, but Calvin's mind could not hold those truths together. "Your daughter," he repeated. Richard did not answer. He let the words sit where they belonged. Claire Donovan opened one of the slim folders in her hand, but she did not speak yet. She understood timing. In business, silence could be sharper than a signed order. Calvin tried to smile. It came out wrong. "Mr. Whitmore, I had no idea. None at all. If I'd known she was your daughter, I never would have." "That is exactly the problem," Richard said. The room stayed still. Calvin blinked. "Sir?" Richard took a step closer to the counter. "If you had known she was connected to me, you would have treated her with care. You would have offered her a seat. You would have taken her resume. You might have even apologized for the spill she didn't make." Calvin swallowed. "But when you thought she was just a young black woman looking for work, you threw a dirty rag at her feet and told her to clean up after someone else." Annie lowered her eyes. Not because she was ashamed, but because hearing it said aloud made the wound sharper. Richard had not exaggerated. He had not softened it. He had named it. Calvin lifted both hands slightly. "I handled it poorly. I can admit that. The restaurant gets busy, tempers run high, and I may have misread the situation." The man in the blue golf shirt stepped forward. "You didn't misread anything. I told you I spilled it." Calvin shot him a look. "Sir, please." "No," the man said. "Don't, sir. Please me now. You kept pushing her after you knew." Claire looked at him. "Your name, sir?" "David Harlan," he said. "I'll give a statement." Evelyn Parker raised her phone a little. "You'll have the recording, too." Calvin's face twitched. Richard turned toward Evelyn. "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded once. "Should have spoken sooner. We all decide when the moment stops letting us hide," Richard said. That line seemed to settle over the older customers more than anyone else. A woman near the window pressed her lips together. Margaret looked down at her own hands. Calvin seized on the quiet. "Mr. Whitmore, this is getting out of proportion. I've run Harbor Light for 14 years. Ask anyone. Ask the regulars. I know this restaurant better than anyone alive. Jamal, still near the kitchen door, said, knowing where the light switches are doesn't mean you know how to treat people. Calvin spun toward him. You are finished. No, Claire said. Calvin turned back. Claire's voice was calm. You are not in a position to terminate anyone. A red flush crept up Calvin's neck. With respect, Miss Donovan, I am still the operational manager. For the next few minutes, perhaps, she said. That was when Calvin finally understood that the ground was not going to come back under his feet. He looked at Richard. You can't make a decision based on one incident. Richard glanced at the rag on the floor. I am not. Calvin frowned. Richard looked at Margaret. How long have you worked here? Margaret's face tightened with fear. 15 years, sir. You saw what happened today? Yes, sir. Was it unusual? Margaret's eyes moved to Calvin, then back to Richard. Her voice came out thin. Not as unusual as it should be. Calvin pointed at her. Careful. Margaret flinched, but she did not stop. I've watched applicants get sent away before they filled out a form. I've watched delivery drivers told to use the back door when other people walked through the front. I've watched Jamal take blame for mistakes he didn't make because it was easier than arguing. Her voice broke at the end. She pressed a hand to her chest. I kept telling myself I needed the job. My husband left me bills when he died. I told myself silence was survival. Jamal looked at her, softer now. Margaret looked at Annie. I'm sorry, honey. I should have moved faster. Annie did not know what to do with the apology. Part of her wanted to accept it because Margaret's pain was real. Another part wanted to ask why her pain had to become public before anyone felt brave. So she chose honesty. Thank you, she said, but I wish someone had stopped him before my papers were torn. Margaret nodded, tears shining in her eyes. You're right. Richard looked proud of Annie then, not because she had forgiven anyone, but because she had not lied to make the room more comfortable. Claire made a note in her folder. Mr. Price, do you have something to add? Jamal gave a short laugh without humor. How much time do you have? Start with today. Today? He looked at Calvin. Today he threw a rag at a girl because he thought she was nobody. That's all today is. Same thing he's always done. Just with witnesses. Calvin's voice rose. This is ridiculous. These people are angry employees. David Harlan crossed his arms. I'm not an employee. Evelyn said, neither am I. The woman in the cardigan added, nor am I. Her husband said, and I'd like to say for the record, I offered that young lady another job lead because nobody should be treated like that while asking for honest work. Claire nodded. We'll collect statements from everyone willing to provide one. Calvin let out a sharp breath. Statements, recordings, over a rag. Richard's eyes hardened. No, Calvin, not over a rag. Over what you believed the rag meant. Calvin said nothing. Richard continued. You believed it meant she was beneath you. You believed the room would accept that. You believed your staff would stay afraid. Your customers would stay quiet. And this young woman would either obey or disappear. Annie felt those words reach places she had tried to keep closed. Obey or disappear. That was what the choice had felt like. Richard turned toward Claire. Begin the removal process. Calvin's mouth fell open. Removal? Claire closed the folder. Effective immediately. You are suspended from all operational duties pending a full investigation. You will surrender keys, office access, point-of-sale credentials, vendor accounts, scheduling authority, and any company property before leaving the premises. This is insane, Calvin said. I built this place. Richard looked around the dining room. No. People like Margaret and Jamal kept it breathing while you mistook fear for loyalty. Calvin stepped back as if struck. For the first time, he looked older. Not humbled, not sorry. Just exposed. He reached into his pocket with a shaking hand and pulled out a ring of keys. They jingled faintly in the quiet room. Front door. Office. Storage room. Back entrance. Liquor cabinet. The small metal pieces that had made him feel permanent. He placed them on the counter. The sound was dull, but everyone heard it. Claire held out her hand. Access card. Calvin unclipped the badge from his belt. His name was printed across it in black letters. Calvin Brooks, General Manager. He stared at it for a second too long before setting it beside the keys. Then he turned to Annie. I didn't know who you were, he said. Annie's throat tightened again, but this time she did not look away. That's why you showed me who you were, she said. No one spoke. Calvin looked at Richard, perhaps hoping for one last opening. Richard gave him none. Claire stepped aside and motioned toward the door. You need to leave now. Calvin walked past the rag, past the puddle, past the torn pieces of Annie's resume. At the door, he paused as if the restaurant might call him back. It did not. The bell rang once when he left. Only after the door closed did the room breathe. For several seconds after Calvin Brooks left, no one inside Harbor Light Grill moved. The bell above the door gave one final tremble, then went still. Outside, Calvin's footsteps faded along the sidewalk. Inside, the puddle remained on the tile, the dirty rag lay half-soaked beside it, and the torn pieces of Annie's resume sat on the counter like something fragile that had been handled by the wrong hands. Annie stared at the door Calvin had walked through. She had imagined many things that morning. A short interview. A polite rejection. Maybe a manager telling her they would call if something opened. She had even prepared herself for being overlooked, but she had not imagined standing in a restaurant while strangers watched her dignity tested against a dirty rag. Richard did not go to her immediately. That was what made her love him more and resent the whole situation less. He understood that if he rushed in now, if he pulled her into his arms in front of everyone, the room might remember her as a daughter rescued by a rich father instead of a young woman who had refused to kneel. So he waited. Claire Donovan stepped toward the counter. Margaret, is there a clean mop in the back? Margaret wiped under one eye with the heel of her hand. Yes, ma'am. Utility closet by the kitchen. Good. Please use that for the water. Leave the rag where it is. Margaret looked down at it. Leave it? Richard answered before Claire could. Yes. Jamal moved first. I'll get the mop. No, Claire said gently. Stay a moment, Mr. Price. I'll need your statement. He nodded, though his shoulders still carried the tension of a man used to expecting punishment after telling the truth. Margaret disappeared toward the kitchen and returned with a yellow mop bucket and a clean mop head. She moved carefully around the dirty rag, cleaning only the water that had spread beyond it. The ordinary sound of the mop against tile seemed too loud now. Every swipe reminded the room of what Calvin had refused to let an employee do because he needed Annie to do it instead. David Harlan, the man in the blue golf shirt, took a step toward Annie. He held one torn corner of her resume in his hand. He had picked it up when no one was looking, maybe because leaving it on the wet floor felt wrong. Miss, he said, his voice quieter than before. I'm sorry. I should have stood up the first second he pointed at you. Annie looked at the piece of paper. Her name was split at the edge. You did stand up, she said. Not soon enough. She wanted to say it was fine, but it wasn't. Fine was too easy a word for what had happened. Fine let people walk away clean. So she said, thank you for telling the truth. David accepted that. He placed the torn piece on the counter beside the others. I'll give whatever statement they need. Claire nodded. I appreciate that. The woman in the pale cardigan rose from her table with her husband close behind. She came toward Annie, slow enough not to crowd her. I meant what I said, the woman told her. About Palmetto Books. My niece manages the place on Meeting Street. Quiet work. Decent people. If you still want something part-time, I can write down her number. Annie blinked. The kindness came at her from an angle she was not ready for. Thank you, ma'am. The woman pulled a small notepad from her purse and wrote carefully, the way older people did when they wanted a number to be readable. My name is Carol Whitaker. You tell my niece Aunt Carol sent you. She can be stubborn, but she has a good heart. Her husband added, and nobody there will throw rags at you. If they do, Carol will go down there herself. For the first time since she had entered the restaurant, Annie almost smiled. Carol tore off the note and handed it to her. Annie took it with both hands, as if accepting something more serious than a phone number. Thank you, she said again. Evelyn Parker lowered her phone at last. Her fingers were stiff around it. She looked older now, not because time had passed, but because the weight of what she had recorded had settled into her face. I have the whole thing, she said to Claire. From when he kicked the rag back at her, Claire's expression tightened. Would you be willing to share it with our office? Yes. Richard turned to Evelyn. You did something important. Evelyn looked at Annie, not Richard. I did it late. Annie felt that answer more deeply than an apology. But you did it. Evelyn nodded, eyes damp. I taught school long enough to know children remember which adults looked away. I suppose we don't stop being responsible just because we retire. No one spoke for a moment. Then Richard walked to the rag. An employee near the back started forward with a trash bag. Richard lifted one hand, stopping him. He bent down himself. Annie's breath caught. She knew his back sometimes stiffened in the morning after long flights, though he never admitted it. She had seen staff bend for him 100 times, open doors, lift boxes, carry bags. Yet there he was, one of the richest men in the state, lowering himself to the tile where Calvin had tried to force her down. But Richard did not kneel like a man being shamed. He bent like a man collecting evidence. He picked up the dirty rag by one corner. Water dripped once onto the floor. Claire opened a clear plastic evidence bag from one of the folders her staff carried. Richard placed the rag inside. "This is not trash," he said. "This is evidence." The sentence moved through the room more quietly than Calvin's shouting had, but with more force. The rag had changed meaning. A few minutes earlier, it had been a weapon. Now it was proof. Claire sealed the bag. "We'll preserve the video, collect statements, and secure the office records. I'll also need access to complaint files, scheduling history, applicant logs, and any deleted personnel notes." Jamal let out a humorless sound. "If the complaint files are still there," Claire looked at him. "You believe some were removed?" Jamal hesitated. Richard said, "You are not speaking to Calvin anymore." That helped. Jamal nodded. People complained. Not always formal, because most folks knew nothing would come of it. But some did. Drivers, applicants, a hostess who quit last spring, a dishwasher before me. Stuff disappeared. Margaret returned the mop to the bucket. There was a folder in the office, gray one. Calvin kept it in the bottom drawer. Then one day it was gone. Claire made a note. Who else had access? Calvin, Margaret said, and Mr. Leland, the district supervisor before the sale. Richard's eyes shifted to Claire. She understood. "We'll include him." Annie listened, each sentence opening the room wider. What happened to her had not begun when the water spilled. It had been waiting there, built into habits, hidden in drawers, protected by people who preferred quiet. The thought made her stomach turn. Richard finally came to her, not too fast. Not like a rescue. Like a father approaching a daughter who had already carried herself through the worst part. "Annie," he said softly. Hearing her name in his voice almost broke her. She looked down because if she looked at him too long, the tears would come. "I wanted to do this without your name. I know. I wanted to walk in like anyone else." "You did." Her throat tightened. "No. I walked in like someone he thought he could treat like nothing." Richard's face changed. The pain there was controlled, but real. "That was his failure," he said. "Not yours. I didn't want you to see me like that. I saw you stand." She shook her head a little. "I was scared. Standing while scared still counts." That was the sentence that almost undid her. For a second, Annie was 6 again, sitting on the edge of a strange bed in a strange house, after losing the mother whose voice she still tried to remember. Richard had stood in the doorway then too, careful not to crowd her, asking if she wanted the hall light left on. He had never forced comfort on her. He had always offered it. Now he did the same. "Can I hug you?" he asked. The question was so gentle that the tears finally slipped free. Annie nodded. Richard stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her. Not tightly enough to hide her. Just enough to let her stop holding herself together for one breath. Around them, people looked away out of respect. Margaret pressed a napkin to her eyes. David cleared his throat. Evelyn lowered her gaze to her tea. After a moment, Annie stepped back and wiped her face quickly. "I'm okay." Richard nodded, though he did not quite believe her. "You don't have to be yet." Claire approached with care. "Annie, I'm sorry to ask, but when you're ready, we'll need your statement. Not now if you don't want to." Annie looked at the sealed bag holding the rag, then at the torn resume, then at the door Calvin had left through. "I'll give it now," she said. Richard studied her. "Are you sure?" She picked up the torn pieces of her resume and stacked them together, not because they could be repaired, but because they were still hers. "Yes," she said. "If he did this before, somebody else may have walked out thinking it was their fault." Jamal looked down. Margaret whispered, "God forgive us." Annie heard her. but did not answer. Forgiveness was too large for the moment. Truth was enough. Claire opened her folder again. All right, start from when you entered. Annie took a breath. Outside, beyond the glass, Charleston moved as if nothing had happened. A carriage rolled past on the street. Tourists walked under the shade of live oaks. Somewhere down the block, a church bell marked the hour. Inside Harbor Light Grill, the floor was clean now, but nobody pretended the place was. Annie looked at Claire and began. I came in to ask for a job. Claire Donovan pulled 2 chairs together near the counter, but Annie did not sit. She wanted to stand. Sitting felt too much like being questioned in a principal's office, and she had not done anything wrong. Richard noticed but said nothing. He stood a few feet away, close enough that she could feel he was there, far enough that no one could pretend he was speaking for her. Claire opened her folder and clicked a pen. Take your time. Annie nodded. Her voice was quieter than before, but it did not shake as much. I came in through the front door. I saw the sign online about part-time help. I walked to the counter and asked if they were still hiring. Margaret stood behind the counter, both hands wrapped around a clean coffee mug she had not filled. That's true. She was polite. I was about to get an application. Claire wrote it down. Then, Mr. Brooks came out, Annie said. She did not look toward the door Calvin had left through. He looked me over and asked if I was here for the back door. Richard's jaw moved once. Claire paused, then continued writing. Exact words? Annie swallowed. Yes, ma'am, he said. You here for the back door? I told him I was here to apply for a job. Jamal let out a slow breath. He says that to delivery drivers, too. Claire looked up. We'll get to that, Annie continued. Then the gentleman spilled the water. David Harlan stepped forward. That was me. I reached for my napkin, knocked the glass with my elbow. She was standing several feet away. Claire nodded. Thank you. I'll need your contact information before you leave. You'll have it. Annie looked at the sealed evidence bag on the counter. The rag inside was folded against the plastic, ugly and small now, but still heavy in the room. He picked up that rag, she said. He threw it at my feet and told me to clean it up. I told him I didn't spill it. He said since I came looking for work, I should prove I could be useful. Claire's pen stopped for half a second. Evelyn Parker spoke from table 6. I have that part on video. Claire glanced at her. We'll make a copy with your permission. You have it. An event on. A waitress tried to help. He stopped her. The cook offered too. He stopped him. The man who spilled the water said he would clean it himself. Mr. Brooks wouldn't let him. Margaret closed her eyes. I should have picked it up anyway. Claire's tone stayed professional, but not cold. Mrs. Ellis, we'll take your statement separately. For now, let Annie finish. Margaret nodded. Annie picked up the torn resume pieces from the counter. She kept them in her hands while she spoke. When I said I wouldn't clean a mess I didn't make, he said I had too much pride for someone begging for a paycheck. I told him I wasn't begging. I was applying. The woman in the pale cardigan, Carol Whitaker, spoke softly. That was exactly what she said. Her husband nodded. Word for word. Annie looked down at the torn papers. Then he tore up my resume. Saying it out loud hurt more than she expected. Not because the paper mattered by itself. She could print another one. But that one had mattered that morning. She had placed it in the folder carefully. She had checked the spelling twice. She had carried it on the bus like it was proof that she was beginning something. Claire's voice gentled. What happened after that? Annie looked at Richard. My father came in. The word father settled differently now that everyone knew. Richard's face softened, but he did not interrupt. He didn't say who he was, Annie said. Mr. Brooks tried to make it sound like I caused the trouble. He told my father I was a new applicant who spilled water and made the place chaotic. The man who actually spilled it corrected him. Other people did too. Claire wrote quickly. Then I arrived. Yes, ma'am. And Mr. Whitmore identified himself. Annie nodded. Yes. Claire closed the folder halfway. That's enough for now. We'll ask for a written statement later, but this gives us the sequence. Annie let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Richard finally moved closer. Do you want to leave? The honest answer was yes. She wanted out of that room, away from the rag, away from the eyes, away from the place where her first attempt at independence had been dragged across a restaurant floor. But she looked at Margaret, at Jamal, at Evelyn, at David, at the torn papers in her hand. "Not yet," she said. Richard studied her. "Why?" "Because if I leave right now, all I remember is what he did. I don't want that to be the last thing." Claire seemed to understand. "Then stay as long as you need." A younger employee, a busboy with freckles and a nervous face, came from the back hallway holding a tray he did not need. "Miss Donovan?" Claire turned. "Yes? There are 2 people outside asking if we're still open." Claire looked at Richard. Richard looked around the dining room. "Not for service." Claire nodded. "Lock the front door for now. Put up a temporary closed sign. No one else comes in until we secure the office." The busboy hesitated. "Do I still have a job?" The question came out so plainly that the room shifted. Richard answered before Claire could. "Yes. No one loses a job today for being afraid of Calvin Brooks." Jamal looked up at that. Richard continued. "But from this moment forward, fear is not how this restaurant will operate." The busboy nodded, relief visible on his face, and went to the door. Claire turned to Jamal. "Mr. Price, you mentioned deleted complaints." Jamal wiped his palms on his apron, though they were already clean. "Some were written down. Some people didn't trust the system enough to write anything." "What system?" He gave a dry laugh. "Calvin," Margaret spoke. "There was supposed to be a complaint form in the break room. Half the time the folder was empty. When someone did fill one out, it went into Calvin's office." "And after that?" Claire asked. Margaret looked at Jamal. Jamal said, "After that, nothing." Claire made another note. "Names?" Jamal hesitated. "I can give some, but people may not want to be dragged into this." Richard said, "They will be asked, not pressured." Jamal nodded. "There was a hostess named Tasha. Good worker. Calvin kept her off the front shifts. Said she didn't have the right look for weekend dinner. She quit last spring." Margaret added, "A delivery driver named Leon. Calvin made him wait outside by the alley, even in the rain. When Leon complained, Calvin called the service and said he was aggressive." David muttered, "That word again." Annie heard it too. Aggressive, attitude, difficult. Words that could turn a person defending themselves into a problem to be managed. Claire looked to Richard. "We'll need access to archived scheduling, vendor communications, delivery platform complaints, and internal emails." "You'll have it," Richard said. At the mention of the office, Margaret's face tightened again. "The gray folder may still be there." Claire turned to her. "Where?" "Bottom drawer, left side of Calvin's desk, unless he moved it." "Did it contain complaints?" "Some. Notes too. Not formal, maybe, but names, dates, things people told me because they didn't know who else to tell." Margaret's voice broke. "I wrote some of them down. I was too scared to send them." Richard looked at her, not unkindly. "Why keep them?" Margaret's eyes filled. "Because I wanted to believe one day someone would ask." No one spoke. That was the quietest truth in the room. Claire motioned to one of the legal staff. "Secure the office. Photograph everything before touching it. If there are paper records, bag and label them. If the computer is on, don't shut it down." The staff member moved down the hallway. Annie watched him go and felt the day widening into something larger than her. She had thought the story was a rag, a resume, a cruel man, and her own humiliation. Now names were appearing. Tasha, Leon, people she had never met, pulled into the light because Calvin had made the mistake of choosing the wrong day to be himself. Richard leaned closer to Annie. "Still with me?" She nodded. "Yes. You don't have to carry all of this. I know." But she did not fully believe it. Evelyn rose slowly from her table and came forward, phone in hand. "Miss Donovan, I'll send you the video. But before I do, I want the girl to decide whether it goes public." Claire glanced at Richard, then at Annie. Annie stared at the phone. Somewhere inside that small device was the worst few minutes of her life. If the video stayed private, the company could still investigate. If it went public, people would know. People would talk. Some would defend her. Some would judge her clothes, her tone, her father, her life. Richard said quietly, "You do not owe the public your pain." Annie looked at him. "But if no one sees it, he gets to call it a misunderstanding. Not with the evidence we have." "Maybe. But what about the people who came before me?" That stopped him. Annie turned to Evelyn. "Not yet," she said. "Please send it to Miss Donovan first." Let them secure the records. After that, if it needs to be seen, I won't hide from it. Evelyn nodded. That sounds wise. Richard looked at Annie with something like sorrow and pride together. From the hallway, the legal staff member called out, Miss Donovan, you need to see this. Claire's head turned. What did you find? A pause, gray folder, bottom drawer. Margaret covered her mouth. Jamal whispered, Damn. Claire looked at Richard. Richard's face went still. Annie felt the air shift again. The floor was clean now. The rag was sealed. Calvin was gone. But the real mess, the one hidden in drawers and silence, was just beginning to show. Claire closed her folder. Everyone, she said. No one leaves yet. Claire Donovan did not raise her voice, but the room obeyed her. No one leaves yet. It was not a threat. It was the sound of a process beginning. And somehow that made everyone stand a little straighter. Customers looked at one another. Margaret gripped the counter. Jamal stared toward the hallway where the legal staff member had called from Calvin's office. Annie felt Richard's hand hover near her shoulder, not touching, just close enough. Claire turned to the young busboy near the door. Lock it from the inside, please. If anyone asks, tell them we are closed for a private matter. Yes, ma'am. The click of the lock carried through the dining room. Annie looked toward the hallway. The gray folder had been found. Those words should not have meant anything to her, but they did. They meant Calvin's cruelty had a paper trail. They meant somebody, somewhere, had tried to leave proof behind. Claire walked toward the office, Richard beside her. Annie followed before anyone could ask whether she wanted to stay. Richard glanced back. Annie, I want to see. He studied her face. You don't have to. I know. That was enough. He let her come. Calvin's office was small and stale, tucked behind the kitchen hallway with one narrow window facing the alley. A framed newspaper clipping hung crooked on the wall. Harbor Light Grill. Celebrates local tradition. Beneath it sat a desk crowded with invoices, vendor catalogs, a cold coffee cup, and a brass nameplate that read, Calvin Brooks, General Manager. The gray folder lay open on the desk. Claire's staff member, a woman named Dana, stood beside it wearing gloves. It was in the bottom drawer, under old tax receipts. Claire leaned in but did not touch. Photographs first? Taken. What's inside? Dana looked uncomfortable. Handwritten notes, complaint forms, some printed emails, a few delivery platform reports. Margaret stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her chest. I wrote some of those. Claire looked at her. You kept copies? Margaret nodded. Not copies. Notes. People would tell me things when they were upset. I didn't know what to do with them. So I wrote dates down. Names. If they gave them. Jamal came up behind her. You never told me. I was scared, Margaret said. And ashamed. Both, I suppose. Richard looked at the folder, then at the crooked article on the wall. Read one. Claire hesitated. Mr. Whitmore. We should preserve chain of custody. Then summarize. Dana lifted the top page slightly with gloved fingers. First note is from last October. Applicant named Tasha Bell. Applied for host position. Note says Calvin told Margaret, quote, don't put her up front. She doesn't fit the weekend image. Jamal's face hardened. Tasha was good. Better than half the people he hired. Margaret whispered. She cried in the parking lot. Annie felt her stomach tighten. Dana looked at the next paper. Delivery driver, Leon Harris. Complaint says he was made to wait outside the back entrance during heavy rain while other drivers used the front pickup shelf. Calvin's handwritten note says, mark aggressive if he calls again. David Harlan, standing just outside the office with Evelyn and Carol, muttered, there's that word again. Claire's face did not change, but her pen moved fast. Keep going. Dana turned another page. Customer complaint from a black couple. They said they were told all window tables were reserved, then watched two walk-in customers seated there 10 minutes later. Margaret covered her mouth. I remember them. Jamal looked at her. What happened? Calvin said they were trying to start trouble for a free meal. Annie stepped back until her shoulder touched the wall. Suddenly the office felt too small. Her story was no longer only hers. It had joined a line of people who had walked through the same door and left carrying something they should never have been handed. Richard noticed. Annie? I'm okay, she said too quickly. No, you aren't. She looked at him. I don't want to be the only one people care about because I'm yours. Richard's face tightened with pain. You won't be. Claire closed the folder gently. This is enough to suspend operations immediately. We'll need to secure all records, contact legal, notify HR, and preserve surveillance footage. Mr. Whitmore, I recommend closing the restaurant for at least 48 hours while we assess exposure. 2 weeks, Richard said. Claire looked up. 2 weeks? Minimum. Paid for scheduled staff. Jamal blinked. Paid? Richard turned to him. No one here loses wages because management failed. Margaret's eyes filled again. Sir, some of the kitchen crew live week to week. Then payroll runs as scheduled. Claire nodded once and made a note. I'll arrange it. Annie looked at Richard then, not as the man who could buy buildings, but as the father who understood that justice did not mean much to people who could not make rent while waiting for it. From the dining room, someone knocked lightly on the office door frame. It was the young busboy. Miss Donovan, there's a man outside asking why we're closed. Says he knows Mr. Brooks. Claire turned. Tell him we are not discussing personnel matters. He's asking if Calvin's still here. Richard answered. Calvin Brooks no longer has authority in this building. The busboy nodded and left. The sentence seemed to steady the room. No longer has authority. Annie had not realized how much authority could linger even after a person walked out. It lived in people's shoulders, in the way Margaret still flinched when Calvin's name came up, in the way Jamal kept checking the hallway. Claire directed her team to bag the folder, photograph the desk, copy the computer drive, and pull time-stamped security footage. She moved cleanly from task to task, turning shock into procedure. Annie watched and understood why Richard trusted her. Claire did not waste outrage. She organized it. Back in the dining room, Evelyn connected her phone to a laptop one of Claire's staff had brought in. The video loaded on the screen, frozen on Calvin's arm mid-throw, the rag suspended in the frame. Annie turned away. Richard stepped beside her. You don't have to watch. I already lived it. I know. No, she said softer. You saw it. But I lived the part before you came in too. Richard took that in. Then tell me what I missed. She looked toward the counter. He looked at me like he had already decided I didn't belong. Richard's voice lowered. I'm sorry. You didn't do it. But I sent you into a world I knew could do it. Annie looked at him. I chose to go. And I chose to let you. That wasn't wrong. Maybe not. But it hurts. For a moment, they stood without solving it. That felt honest. Near the window, Carol Whitaker approached with her notepad still in hand. I don't mean to interrupt. Richard stepped back slightly. Not at all. Carol looked at Annie. My niece at Palmetto Books. The offer stands. No pressure. You call only if you want to. Annie took the note again, folded it, and slipped it into her pocket. I might. Carol nodded. Good. And if you don't, that's fine too. Just don't let this man be the last word on your first job search. That landed somewhere warm and sore. Annie said, I won't. Claire returned from the office with the sealed gray folder. We'll be contacting everyone named in these records. Carefully. Privately. First. Richard nodded. And Calvin? Formal notice today. Termination pending. Final review. But based on witnessed conduct, video, and preliminary records, I don't see a path for reinstatement. Jamal let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. Margaret sat down on a stool behind the counter. I kept thinking somebody would come one day and see it. Richard looked around the dining room, the old photographs, the polished counter, the painted promise above it. Someone should have come sooner. No one argued. Claire slipped the folder into a locked case. Mr. Whitmore, press may get wind of this if the video circulates. Richard looked at Annie first. We're not making that decision for her. Annie appreciated that, but the weight of it scared her. One video could change everything. It could bring justice. It could also bring strangers into her face, her clothes, her family, her adoption, her reasons for wanting a job. Evelyn seemed to read her thoughts. Child, you don't owe the world a performance. Annie gave a small, tired smile. Everybody keeps telling me what I don't owe, because people will try to collect it anyway, Evelyn said. The room quieted at that. Outside, footsteps passed by the locked door. A couple looked through the glass. read the handwritten closed sign, and moved on. Annie walked to the counter and gathered the last torn pieces of her resume. She did not know why she wanted every scrap, but she did. Claire handed her a small envelope without being asked. "Here," Claire said. Annie placed the pieces inside. Richard watched her seal it. "What will you do with that?" "I don't know yet," but part of her did know. She would not throw it away. Not today. Maybe not ever. Claire's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then at Richard. "Legal is ready. HR is assembling a response team. I can have counselors available for staff tomorrow morning." "Do that," Richard said. Jamal looked surprised. "Counselors?" Richard nodded. "People shouldn't have to carry a bad workplace home and call it normal." Margaret lowered her head. Annie looked at the sealed rag, the locked folder, the envelope in her hand. 3 small containers for 3 kinds of damage. What was done to her, what was hidden from others, and what she had tried to build for herself before Calvin tore it apart. The floor was dry now. The restaurant was closed. But for the first time since she walked in, Annie felt the truth had somewhere to go. By late afternoon, Harbor Light Grill no longer felt like a restaurant. The chairs were pushed in. The coffee machine had gone quiet. The handwritten closed sign hung inside the front door, and the smell of butter and bacon had faded into the heavier scent of mop water, old wood, and something no one wanted to name. Claire Donovan's team moved through the building with quiet purpose. One person copied files from Calvin's office computer. Another photographed the break room bulletin board, the employee schedule, the complaint box with no forms inside it. A third labeled the sealed evidence bags. Rag, gray folder, printed complaint records, handwritten notes. Annie sat at the counter with the envelope holding her torn resume in front of her. She had not opened it. She kept one finger on the flap, as if the paper might disappear if she stopped touching it. Richard stood near the front window, speaking softly into his phone. He had called legal, then human resources, then someone about payroll. Each conversation was short, controlled, and final. Annie caught pieces. "No one misses a paycheck. Preserve everything. No public statement until we speak with the people harmed. No, this is not one bad manager. Treat it as a systems failure." That phrase stayed with her. A systems failure. It sounded clean, almost mechanical, like a broken air conditioner or a cash register that would not open. But Annie knew what it looked like on a person's face. It looked like Margaret flinching, Jamal swallowing his anger, Leon waiting in the rain, Tasha crying in the parking lot. It looked like a dirty rag at her feet. Claire came to the counter and sat one stool away from Annie, leaving space between them. "I'm going to ask something," Claire said. "You can say no." Annie looked at her. "Okay. Would you be willing to write a statement tonight, while it's still fresh? Not for the public. For the investigation." Annie glanced toward the envelope. "I already told you what happened." "You did. A written statement helps because it is yours, in your own words, before anyone else tries to explain the day for you." Annie understood that. Calvin had tried to explain it before Richard had even said his name. New applicant. Got careless. Made a scene. Nothing serious. She nodded. "I'll write it." Claire slid a legal pad and pen across the counter. "Take your time." Annie picked up the pen but did not start. Across the room, Evelyn Parker was putting her phone into her purse. She moved slowly, the way older people did when the body had more memories than the mind asked for. David Harlan stood near the door, giving his contact information to one of Claire's staff. Carol Whitaker and her husband waited by their table, not rushing, not hovering. Margaret came from the kitchen holding a tray of coffee cups. "I know we're closed," she said quietly, "but I made a fresh pot. Seemed wrong to leave everyone sitting in here with nothing." Claire looked at Richard. Richard nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis." Margaret poured coffee for Evelyn, David, Carol, her husband, and Jamal. When she reached Annie, she hesitated. "Would you like some, honey? Or sweet tea?" "Tea, please," Annie said. Margaret brought it in a tall glass with ice and a lemon wedge on the rim. Her hands trembled when she set it down. "I don't know what to say to you," Margaret said. Annie wrapped both hands around the cold glass. "You don't have to say anything." "I do." Margaret looked toward the office hallway. "I watched him do smaller versions of this for years. Smaller only because they didn't happen all at once. I told myself I was too old to start over. Told myself if I kept my head down, I could make it to retirement. Annie did not answer. Margaret swallowed. That wasn't courage. That was fear dressed up as patience. The sentence was too honest to dismiss. Annie looked at her. Why did you keep the notes? Margaret's eyes went wet again. Because I was a coward with a conscience. I couldn't speak, but I couldn't forget either. Jamal, standing near the pass-through window, said, "That's more than some did." Margaret looked at him. It wasn't enough. "No," Jamal said. But it was something. Annie listened to them and felt the anger inside her shift shape. It did not go away. It became more complicated. Calvin was easy to hate. Margaret was harder. She had failed people, but she had also left a trail for someone to find. Human beings were rarely as clean as stories wanted them to be. Richard ended his call and came back to the counter. Legal will send formal notice to Calvin tonight. Jamal looked up. He's really gone? Yes. Not suspended for 2 days and then back like nothing happened? No. Jamal stared down at the coffee Margaret had poured him. I didn't realize how tired I was until you said that. Richard's voice softened. How long have you worked here? 6 years. And how long has it been like this? Jamal gave a short laugh. Depends what you mean by this. The yelling? Always. The comments? Always. The way he watches who walks through the door and decides how much respect they get? Always. Claire returned to her notes. We'll need examples. You'll get them, Jamal said, but not just from me. You should talk to the dishwashers, the drivers, the weekend hosts. Talk to the people who don't get invited to staff meetings because Calvin thinks they don't matter. Annie looked down at the blank legal pad. People who don't matter. That was where she started writing. I came to Harbor Light Grill because I wanted to apply for a part-time job. I did not come with my father. I did not use his name. I wanted to be treated like anyone else. She paused. The words looked plain on the page. Too plain for how it had felt. She kept writing. Mr. Brooks looked at my clothes before he asked why I was there. After a customer spilled water, he threw a dirty rag at my feet and told me to clean it up. I told him I did not spill it. He said since I came looking for work, I should prove I was useful. Her hand tightened around the pen. I felt embarrassed. I felt angry. I felt like everyone was waiting to see whether I would lower myself so the room could feel normal again. She stopped there because the tears threatened again. Richard did not read over her shoulder. He looked away, giving her privacy even in a room full of witnesses. Carol Whitaker walked to the counter and placed a small white card beside Annie's tea. That's my niece's number at Palmetto Books. I added mine too, not to push you. Just so you have someone to call who isn't connected to all this. Annie touched the card. Thank you. Carol smiled faintly. When I was your age, I worked at a 5 and dime in Columbia. First week there, a man threw coins on the counter and told me girls with country accents ought to be grateful for any job. I went home and cried into a sink full of dishes. Annie looked up. Carol shrugged. Different time, different insult, same feeling. What did you do? Went back the next day because I needed the money, but I never forgot his face. Not because he mattered. Because that was the day I promised myself I'd never make a young person feel small for trying to work. Her husband, standing behind her, said, she kept that promise, raised 3 children and half the neighborhood with it. Carol waved him off, but her eyes softened. Annie felt something loosen in her chest. This was why the story would matter to older people, she thought without meaning to think like that. Not because they had all lived her exact pain, but because most had met someone who used a job, a counter, a title, or a little bit of power to make them feel small. Richard sat beside Annie at last. May I? She slid the legal pad slightly toward him, then stopped. No, not yet. He nodded. Fair. I want the first version to be mine. It should be. She wrote again. When my father came in, Mr. Brooks changed his voice. He smiled at him. He offered him coffee. He lied and said I caused the mess. That hurt almost as much as the rag because it showed he knew how to be respectful. He just chose not to be respectful to me. The pen paused. That was the heart of it. Calvin had known how to behave. He had proven it the second Richard walked in. Claire's phone buzzed. She stepped aside to answer, listened, then said, send it securely, and confirm the timestamp. She ended the call and looked at Richard. "We have preliminary surveillance from the front camera. No audio, but it shows the customer spilling the water and Calvin throwing the rag." David Harlan shook his head. "So he can't say he didn't." "He may still try," Claire said. Evelyn tapped her purse. "Then he'll have my video with sound." Richard looked toward Annie. "Only when you're ready." Annie finished the last line of her statement. "I do not want this handled only because I am Richard Whitmore's daughter. I want it handled because the next person who walks in wearing old shoes may not have a father who owns the building." She set the pen down. Claire read the line only after Annie slid the pad toward her. Her face changed, just a little. "That will matter," Claire said. Annie looked at the sealed rag on the counter, then at the envelope with her torn resume. "It better," she said. Outside, the sky had started to dim over Charleston. The windows reflected the dining room back at itself. The empty tables, the closed sign, the people still standing where something had broken open. Richard reached for his phone again, then stopped. Annie noticed. "What?" "I was going to arrange the car." She almost smiled. "I took the bus here." "I know. I can take it back." "No," he said, then caught himself. "I'm sorry. That came out wrong." She waited. He tried again. "May I take you home?" The question mattered. Annie looked around the restaurant one more time. The place where she had tried to begin had become something else entirely. She was tired now, tired in her bones, but she did not feel defeated. "Yes," she said, "you can take me home." Richard nodded. Claire came over with a copy of Annie's written statement sealed in a folder. "We'll be in touch tomorrow. I'll also have someone contact you about whether you want representation before anything public happens." Annie looked at her. "Representation? You deserve someone whose only job is protecting you." Richard said, "I can arrange." Annie glanced at him. He stopped. Claire noticed and said, "We'll give you options. You choose." Annie nodded. "Thank you." As they walked toward the door, Evelyn called after her. "Annie." She turned. Evelyn held up her phone. "Whatever you decide about the video, don't let anyone tell you the truth is rude." Annie looked at the old teacher, the woman who had recorded when others looked away. "I won't," she said. Richard opened the door. This time, he did not step through first. He held it and let Annie walk out ahead of him. The evening air was warm, and the street outside looked unchanged. Tourists still passed with shopping bags. A carriage rolled slowly at the corner. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed like nothing in the world had shifted. Annie stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing. Behind her, Harbor Light Grill remained closed, the lights still on, the old promise painted above the counter waiting to be earned. Richard's car was parked half a block away, not in front of the restaurant. Annie noticed that and almost laughed, though she had no strength for it. Even when worried, her father thought in layers. He had not wanted Calvin or anyone else to see a black sedan waiting by the curb, and guess who she was before she had a chance to be ordinary. Now ordinary felt far away. They walked side by side beneath the late Charleston light. The air held the smell of warm stone, carriage horses, fried seafood from somewhere down the block, and rain that had not fallen yet. Tourists moved around them with shopping bags and paper cups, unaware that inside the closed restaurant behind them, a dirty rag sat sealed in evidence plastic, and a gray folder was beginning to speak for people who had been ignored. Richard opened the passenger door for her. Annie paused. "You don't have to do that." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I'm your father, not because you need help getting into a car." She looked at him, then got in. He closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. For a while after he started the engine, neither of them spoke. The city passed slowly outside the windows. Pastel houses, iron balconies, live oaks bending over narrow streets. Couples leaving restaurants early, an old man sweeping the front step of a shop that had probably been there longer than both of them. Annie held the envelope with her torn resume in her lap. Richard noticed but kept his eyes on the road. "Do you want to talk?" "No." "All right." A minute passed. "I don't want not to talk either," she said. He nodded. "That happens." She stared out the window. "He changed when you walked in." "Yes. Not a little. Completely. I saw. He knew how to be nice. That's what bothers me. He knew how. He just looked at me and decided I wasn't worth the effort." Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That kind of decision is older than him." "I know," but knowing that doesn't make it hurt less. No, Annie said, it doesn't. They stopped at a red light. A family crossed in front of them, a grandmother holding a little boy's hand. The boy had a paper bag from a candy shop and kept trying to peek inside. Annie watched them until they reached the other curb. When you said I was your daughter, everyone looked at me differently. Richard glanced at her. I'm sorry. I'm not mad that you said it. I know. I'm mad that it worked. The light turned green. Richard drove on. That sentence stayed in the car with them. Annie swallowed. Before that, I was a problem. After that, I was someone they had to be careful with. Richard's voice was low. You were always someone they should have been careful with. But they weren't. No. She looked down at the envelope. I wanted to do one thing without the Whitmore name opening the door. Instead, it had to come in and tear the door off the hinges. Richard almost smiled at the phrasing, but did not. That name belongs to you too. Does it? The question came out before she could soften it. Richard pulled into a quiet side street and parked beneath an oak. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt large. He looked at her. Yes. Annie shook her head. You don't understand. Then tell me. She pressed the envelope flat against her knees. When people say Whitmore, they see you. Hotels, buildings, donations, newspaper photos, that speech you gave at the children's hospital. They see power. When they look at me, sometimes I can feel them trying to make the math work. What math? How a black girl in old sneakers fits into a white billionaire's family. Richard's face changed, but he stayed quiet. At school, people used to say I was lucky, Annie continued. Teachers said it kindly. Parents said it at fundraisers. Girls said it when they were mad. Lucky Annie. Saved Annie. Charity Annie. Richard closed his eyes for 1 second. I thought if I got a job on my own, if someone hired me without knowing you, it would prove I wasn't just. She stopped. Just what? Something you did. Richard turned fully toward her. Annie, she blinked hard. I know you don't think that. I don't. I know. But other people do. And sometimes I get tired of proving I'm a person, not a good deed. He took that in as if every word cost him something. I should have known how heavy that was. You knew some of it. Not enough. She looked out through the windshield. Spanish moss hung from the oak branches, moving slightly in the humid air. Richard said, When I adopted you, people did congratulate me. I hated it. Annie looked back at him. They made it sound noble, he said. Like love was a public service. I never knew what to say without making your life a headline. So I said little and tried to make sure you were safe. You did make me safe. Maybe too safe. She gave a small, tired breath. That's what I was trying to find out. He nodded. And today I learned something too. What? That letting you stand on your own does not mean standing too far away. Annie's throat tightened. Richard looked at the envelope. May I see it? She hesitated, then handed it to him. He opened the flap and slid out the torn pieces of resume. He laid them carefully on the center console, aligning the edges as best he could. Her name came together unevenly. Annie Whitmore. Under it, education, volunteer hours, summer reading program assistant, basic computer skills, available weekends. He read it as if it were a contract worth millions. This is a good resume, he said. She almost cried again, which annoyed her. It's 1 page. All strong things start as 1 page. Dad. I mean it. He placed the pieces back in the envelope, but he did not seal it. We can print another. I know, but this one matters. Yes. Then keep it. I was going to. He handed it back. Good. A phone buzzed. Richard checked the screen, then showed her. Claire. Annie nodded, giving permission. Richard answered on speaker. Claire. We secured the office records, Claire said. Preliminary review shows at least 5 written complaints over the last 3 years, plus handwritten notes from Mrs. Ellis. We also found email correspondence with a former district supervisor, Martin Leland. Some of it suggests he knew complaints were not being escalated. Richard's expression hardened. Preserve everything. Already done. Legal is drafting hold notices now. HR wants to begin staff interviews tomorrow morning. Paid time. Yes. Also, local chatter has started. Someone outside took a photo of the closed sign and posted that there was an incident. Nothing specific yet. Richard looked at Annie. The video? Still with us and Mrs. Parker. She has not posted it. Annie listened, her stomach tight. Claire continued. We should prepare for it becoming public. Even if Mrs. Parker holds back, another customer may have recorded part of it. Richard said, no statement tonight, without Annie's approval. Understood. Annie, are you there? I'm here, Annie said. Claire's voice softened. How are you holding up? Annie almost gave the automatic answer. Fine. Instead, she said, I don't know yet. That's fair. You don't need to decide anything tonight. But I want you to know this will not be handled quietly, just to protect the company. Annie looked at Richard. He said, that was never an option. Claire said, I'll call in the morning. Try to rest. The call ended. Annie sat back. People are going to find out. Probably. They'll talk about me. Yes. They'll talk about you adopting me. Richard did not lie. Some will. They'll say I only got justice because my father owns the place. Some will say that too. She turned toward him, and they won't be completely wrong. Richard was quiet for a moment. No, but they won't be completely right either. What does that mean? It means my power opened the investigation. Your refusal made the truth visible. The witnesses gave it weight. Margaret's notes gave it history. Jamal's statement will give it depth. Justice rarely arrives from one clean source. Annie looked at him. He continued. It comes late. It comes messy. It comes with people who should have acted sooner, and people who act because they finally can. That doesn't make it worthless. She thought about that. Outside, a horse carriage rolled past the end of the street. The driver tipped his hat to someone on the sidewalk. The city kept doing what cities did, holding beauty and harm on the same block. Annie said, I still want a job. Richard leaned back slightly, as if he had expected many things, but not that. Today? No, not today. She almost smiled. I'm not that stubborn. You are exactly that stubborn. Maybe tomorrow's stubborn. He let out a breath that was close to a laugh. I don't want Calvin to be the reason I stop, she said. If I stop now, he gets to become the whole lesson. And what do you want the lesson to be? Annie looked at the envelope in her lap. That work has dignity. But dignity can't depend on whether someone hires you. Richard nodded slowly. That is a better lesson. She looked at him. Will you let me try again? There was the old fear in his face, but now it had learned something. Yes, he said. But this time, not alone in the way you mean alone. You choose the place. You make the call. You do the interview. I don't interfere, but I know where you are, and you call me if something turns wrong. That sounds like a father contract. I'm very good at contracts. Too many clauses. Non-negotiable. She smiled for real this time, small but real. Richard started the car again and pulled back onto the street. As they drove toward home, Annie watched the city lights come on one by one. She felt exhausted, exposed, angry, and steadier than she had expected to feel. Behind them, Harbor Light Grill remained closed. Inside it were sealed records, a dirty rag, a gray folder, and a promise painted on the wall that had finally been challenged to mean something. Annie leaned her head against the window, still holding the envelope. She had gone out that morning to earn her first paycheck. Instead, she had found the first line of a fight that was bigger than her. The Whitmore house was quiet when they returned, but not peaceful. Annie could feel the difference as soon as she stepped through the front door. The same polished floor, the same lamp glowing on the entry table, the same faint smell of lemon oil and old books. Yet everything seemed too clean after Harbor Light Grill, too arranged, too untouched. Richard handed his keys to the small bowl by the door and watched her as she stood in the foyer with the envelope still in her hand. Do you want dinner? He asked. No. Tea? Maybe later. Do you want to be alone? Annie almost said yes. Then she looked down at the torn resume inside the envelope and changed her mind. Can we sit somewhere that doesn't feel like a museum? Richard glanced around the large entry hall, then nodded. Kitchen. That was where they always went when life was too much for the dining room. The kitchen was warm, with copper pans hanging above the island and a bowl of peaches Mrs. Alvarez had left near the sink. Richard took off his suit jacket and draped it over a chair. Annie sat at the island, pulled the envelope into her lap, and listened to him fill the kettle. For a while, neither of them spoke. The ordinary sounds helped. Water running, a cabinet opening, 2 mugs set down, a spoon touching ceramic. Richard placed tea in front of her and sat across the island. Annie looked at the mug. Do you think I was stupid? No. You didn't even ask what I meant. I know what you meant. She rubbed her thumb along the envelope's edge. I dressed like that on purpose. I took the bus on purpose. I didn't tell anyone my last name meant anything. I wanted to see if I could get hired without help. That isn't stupid. It feels stupid now. It feels painful. That's different. Annie hated how quickly that answer reached her. She looked away toward the dark window over the sink. Her reflection stared back, tired and smaller than she wanted to look. Richard waited. She finally said, "When he looked at me, I could feel him deciding." Richard's expression tightened. Deciding what? What I was worth. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled behind them. I've had people underestimate me before, Annie said. But today was different. He didn't even need to know me to dislike me. My shoes were enough. My jacket was enough. My skin was enough. Richard's fingers closed around his mug, but he did not interrupt. And the worst part is, I kept thinking maybe I should just pick up the rag so it would stop. Just for 1 second. Her voice dropped. I hate that I thought that. Don't. I do. Annie, humiliation is designed to make obedience feel like escape. That thought was not weakness. It was the trap working. Her eyes stung again, and she was tired of that too. I don't want to cry anymore. Then don't. She gave him a sharp look. He lifted both hands slightly. I mean, you don't owe tears either. Not to me. Not to him. Not to the day. Her anger softened before it could fully form. You always do that. What? Make things sound simple when they aren't. They are not simple, but sometimes a sentence can give a person somewhere to stand. She looked down at the tea. I didn't feel like I was standing. I saw you. You came in at the end. I came in before the end. That made her quiet. Richard reached into his shirt pocket and took out his reading glasses, then seemed to realize he had nothing to read. He set them on the island. It was such an ordinary, fatherly gesture that Annie almost smiled. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at it but did not pick it up. Claire? Annie asked. Legon. You should answer. No. Dad. They can wait 10 minutes. She studied him. Can they? Yes. Despite what some people think, the world does not collapse when rich men stop answering phones. This time she did smile, barely. He smiled back. Then the phone buzzed again. His expression changed. Claire, he said. Annie nodded. Richard answered on speaker. Go ahead. Claire's voice came through clear and tired. We completed the initial inventory. The gray folder contains 9 handwritten notes from Mrs. Ellis, 5 customer complaint forms, 2 delivery platform disputes, and printed emails between Calvin Brooks and Martin Leland. The emails are not good. Richard's face hardened. How not good? One message from Leland to Calvin, dated 8 months ago, after a complaint from a delivery driver. Leland wrote, handled, don't let it hit regional. Another says, front image matters. Use judgment. It appears complaints were being contained locally. Annie stared at the phone. Contained. Like spilled water. Like something to mop up before anyone saw. Richard's voice stayed level. Suspend Leland's system access tonight. Already done. HR will notify him in the morning. Also, Calvin is called twice. I did not answer. He texted that he wants to explain before we make a mistake. Annie let out a small sound. Not a laugh. Not quite. Richard looked at her. She said, a mistake. Claire heard. Yes. Richard said, reply in writing only. No direct conversation. All communication through legal. Understood. There is something else. A partial clip is already online. Annie went still. Richard leaned forward. From whom? We don't know yet. It's only 12 seconds. Calvin kicking the rag back toward Annie and saying, pick it up. No context. But enough. It has a few thousand views already. Local accounts are sharing it. The kitchen seemed to shrink. Annie's hands went cold around the mug. Does it show my face? Claire paused. Yes, not close, but yes. Richard closed his eyes for 1 second. Can it be taken down? Not realistically. We can request, but it will spread faster than removal. We need to prepare a statement. No statement without Annie. I agree. Annie pushed the tea away. People are already watching it? I'm sorry, Claire said. Yes. Are they saying things? Another pause. Richard said, Claire, some are defending you, Claire said carefully. Some are asking what happened before the clip. Some are making assumptions. That is why we need a full, accurate account ready. Annie stood from the stool. I need a minute. Richard reached toward her but stopped before touching. Annie, I just need a minute. She left the kitchen and walked down the hall, not running, because running would make it feel worse. She went into the small den near the back of the house, the one with the old leather sofa and shelves full of books Richard actually read. She shut the door halfway and stood in the dark. Her phone was in her pocket. She should not look. She knew she should not look. She looked. The clip was easy to find. Too easy. Someone had captioned it. Manager forces young woman to clean spill she says she didn't make. Charleston restaurant incident? The video started mid-humiliation. Calvin's shoe pushed the rag toward her. His voice snapped, pick it up. Annie saw herself step back. Folder clutched against her chest. Eyes wide before she forced her face still. She watched it once. Then again. The second time, she noticed things she had missed while living it. Margaret's hand flying to her mouth. Jamal in the kitchen doorway. David Harlan half out of his chair. Evelyn's phone visible at the edge of the frame. She had felt alone, but she had not been invisible. That did not make it easy. Comments moved under the clip. Who is she? What happened before this? Why didn't she just leave? Manager needs to be fired. There's always more to the story. Richard knocked once on the half-open door. May I come in? Annie locked the phone and wiped her face quickly. Yes. He entered and sat at the other end of the sofa, leaving space. I watched it, she said. I figured. Somebody wrote, why didn't she just leave? Richard's eyes darkened. People who have never been trapped by a moment think every door is easy to use. Annie looked at her phone. I hate that strangers get to decide what kind of victim I am. You are not required to be a victim for them. What am I then? My daughter, he said. A young woman who went looking for work. A person who was wronged. A witness. Maybe, if you choose. A voice. But you are not internet property. She breathed out slowly. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. Claire is right about one thing. If a short clip is out there, silence lets other people write the story. Annie looked at him. So what do? We tell the truth, carefully. We protect your privacy where we can. We do not over-explain your life to strangers. We do not make you a company mascot for reform, and we do not let Calvin call cruelty a misunderstanding. Annie held the phone between both hands. Will you say I'm your daughter? If you want me to. If you don't, people will find out anyway. Probably. If you do, people will say that's the only reason anything happened. Some will. She hated that he would not lie to comfort her. Richard said, we can say the company is investigating discrimination and mistreatment of an applicant. We do not have to lead with our relationship. But it matters. It does. Not because I deserve more than anyone else. No, because he changed when you walked in. Richard nodded. That is the point. Annie looked back at the dark phone screen. Her reflection floated there, faint and tired. I want the statement to say that, she said. Richard waited. I want it to say he knew how to be respectful. He proved that when you came in, he just didn't think I deserved it. Richard's face softened with pride and pain. That is clear. And I don't want it to sound like you saved me. I didn't. She looked at him. You stood before I spoke, he said. I will keep saying that as many times as needed. Annie swallowed. They returned to the kitchen together. Richard called Claire back. And this time Annie sat beside him, not across the room. Claire answered immediately. I'm here. Annie spoke before her father could. I want to help write the statement. Good, Claire said. We'll draft around your words. Annie took the legal pad from earlier and pulled it toward her. What do you want it to say? Claire asked. Annie looked at Richard, then at the envelope on the island, then at her own hands. She began slowly. Today, I entered Harbor Light Grill to apply for a part-time job. I was not an employee. I did not spill the water I was ordered to clean. When I refused to pick up a dirty rag thrown at my feet, my application was torn and I was told to leave. Claire's typing clicked softly through the phone. Annie continued. This matters not because of who my father is, but because no applicant, worker, customer, or stranger should have to prove their worth by accepting humiliation. Richard looked down. Annie's voice steadied. The investigation should include everyone who was treated this way before me. Claire stopped typing for a moment. That is strong. It's true. Yes, Claire said. It is. Richard added. Include that Harbor Light will remain closed during the investigation and staff will be paid. Claire typed. Already included. And no one named in the files is to be contacted by media from our side without consent. Agreed. Annie leaned back, exhausted again but clearer. Can we say the video clip doesn't show the whole story? Claire said. Yes, but we should not sound defensive. Then say the full record is being preserved, Annie said. Witnesses, video, documents. Richard looked at her. You're good at this. I had a good teacher. He gave her a tired smile. Claire read the draft aloud. It was short, direct, and did not use Annie's last name until the end, where it confirmed she was Richard Whitmore's daughter only because that fact had influenced how Calvin's behavior changed. It promised an independent review and invited former employees, applicants, delivery workers, and customers with relevant experiences to contact a third-party line. Annie listened carefully. At the end, she said, add one sentence. Claire waited. Annie said, dignity should not depend on whether someone recognizes your last name. The kitchen went quiet. Richard looked away for a second. Claire said softly, I'll add it. The statement went out at 9:17 p.m. By then, the 12-second clip had become longer in the public mind than 12 seconds. People were already arguing, judging, defending, doubting. But now the truth had a place to stand. Annie took her tea upstairs cold and untouched. Before bed, she opened the envelope and laid the torn resume pieces on her desk. She did not try to tape them together. Not yet. She only placed Richard's graduation pen beside them. Then she turned off the light, knowing morning would bring more voices. But this time, Calvin Brooks would not be the only one telling the story. By morning, Annie's sentence was everywhere. Dignity should not depend on whether someone recognizes your last name. It appeared under the official statement, then in screenshots, then in posts shared by people Annie had never met. Some wrote that it said everything. Others argued over it, because people online could argue over rain falling from the sky. By 8 o'clock, 3 local news stations had called Whitmore hospitality. By 9, a Charleston paper had published a short article with the headline, Harbor Light Grill, closed after alleged mistreatment of job applicant. Alleged. Annie stared at that word on her phone while sitting at the kitchen island in one of Richard's old sweatshirts. It was too large on her, soft at the sleeves, smelling faintly of cedar from the closet. She had slept badly, waking twice from dreams where Calvin kept pushing the rag toward her, and the room kept getting longer every time she stepped back. Richard entered the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside her, though she had never liked coffee black. You look like you fought the mattress and lost, he said. I think the mattress had help. He sat beside her. Did you read comments? A few. That was unwise. I know. Will you do it again? Probably. At least you're honest. She slid the phone across the island. They used alleged. Richard glanced at the screen. Newsrooms use that until investigations are complete. There's video. There is. There are witnesses. Yes. There's a dirty rag in a plastic bag. Yes. But still alleged. Richard folded his hands around his coffee. The world often gives cruelty more procedural courtesy than it gives the people hurt by it. Annie looked at him. That sounds like something you say when you're trying not to cuss. It is. That pulled a small laugh out of her, which surprised them both. Mrs. Alvarez came in through the side door carrying a grocery bag and stopped when she saw Annie. Her face softened at once. Mija. Annie stood just in time to be pulled into a hug that smelled like laundry soap and cinnamon gum. I saw the statement, Mrs. Alvarez said, holding Annie by the shoulders. I did not watch the video. I did not need to. I know your face when you are hurt. Annie's throat tightened. I'm okay. No, you are here. That is different. Mrs. Alvarez touched her cheek, then turned to Richard. And you? Did you eat? Richard blinked. Good morning to you too. You look like you swallowed a courthouse. Annie smiled again, a little stronger this time. The moment did not last. Richard's phone rang, and the name on the screen was Claire. He put it on speaker. "We're all here," he said. Claire sounded like she had been awake for hours. "The statement is holding. Most coverage is accurate. But the partial clip has spread beyond Charleston. We now have multiple former employees contacting the third-party line. HR has scheduled interviews. Legal recommends we issue a separate notice inviting applicants and delivery drivers from the past 5 years to submit experiences confidentially." Richard looked at Annie before answering. "Do it," Claire continued. "There's more. Calvin's attorney emailed a response at 6:12 this morning. They claim the incident was mischaracterized, that Annie was disruptive, and that Calvin was enforcing workplace readiness standards." Annie went cold. "Workplace readiness?" Richard's voice lowered. "Send it to me." "I already did. Do not answer personally." "I know." Claire paused. "Annie, I'm sorry you have to hear this. But you should be prepared. His side may try to make this about entitlement. Rich daughter. Secret test. Setup. That sort of thing." Annie closed her eyes. There it was, the shape of the next attack. Richard said, "She did not set him up." "I know," Claire said. "The full video helps. The surveillance helps. Witnesses help. But public narratives don't always wait for facts." Mrs. Alvarez muttered something in Spanish under her breath. Annie sat down slowly. "What do we do?" Claire answered her directly. "We stay factual. We don't chase every comment. We keep the investigation clean. We let witnesses speak if they choose. We protect your privacy where possible." Annie looked at Richard. "What about the people in the folder?" "We start contacting them today," Claire said. "Privately. Carefully. Some may want nothing to do with this. Some may want to speak. Their choice." That mattered to Annie. She did not want other people's pain dragged into the street just because hers already had been. "Good," she said. Claire's tone softened. "Also, Mrs. Ellis asked if she could come in this morning before staff interviews. She said she has something else." Richard straightened. "What?" "She wouldn't say over the phone, only that she should have brought it forward years ago." Richard looked at Annie. "Do you want to be there?" Annie did not answer right away. Part of her wanted to stay in the kitchen, wearing an oversized sweatshirt, protected by coffee cups and Mrs. Alvarez's angry love. Another part knew the story was still moving, with or without her. "Yes," she said. "I want to be there." Richard hesitated, then nodded. "We leave in 20 minutes. Mrs. Alvarez pointed at both of them. "You leave after eggs." "Maria," Richard began. "No, Justice can wait 7 minutes for protein." Annie laughed for real that time. Not loudly, but enough. When they arrived at Harbor Light Grill, the restaurant looked different in daylight with the closed sign still taped to the glass. No smell of bacon. No clatter of plates. No customers waiting to be seated. Just the old building holding its breath. A small group of reporters stood across the street. Richard had arranged for them to enter through the side alley, but one photographer still caught sight of the car. Cameras lifted. "Mr. Whitmore, is the applicant your daughter?" "Annie, did you know he owned the restaurant? Was this a test?" Richard kept walking, one hand near Annie's back but not touching. Annie looked straight ahead. Inside, Claire met them by the counter. The rag was gone, secured with evidence. The torn resume was with Annie. The floor was clean, but she could still see the place where it had been wet. Margaret sat at a table near the window, a canvas tote bag at her feet. She looked older than yesterday. Not weaker, just more exposed. Jamal stood near the kitchen door with a paper cup of coffee. He nodded to Annie. "Morning. Morning." It felt strange, ordinary words inside a place that no longer was. Margaret stood when Annie approached. "Thank you for coming." Annie did not know what to say to that. "Claire said you had something." Margaret looked at Richard, then at Claire. "I do." She reached into the tote and pulled out 3 spiral notebooks. The kind sold for $1 before school starts. The covers were bent, corners soft from years of being carried around. Claire's eyes sharpened. "What are those?" Margaret placed them on the table. "My shift notebooks. I started keeping them after my husband died. At first it was just hours, tips, who called out sick. Then I started writing things Calvin said. Things customers complained about. Names of people he turned away. I don't know why. Maybe because if I wrote it down, I wasn't pretending it didn't happen. Jamal stared at the notebooks. Margaret, I know, she said, tears already gathering. I should have done more. Claire sat across from her. May I review them? Margaret pushed them forward. Yes. Claire opened the first notebook carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting. Dates in the margin. Short entries. Some ordinary. Truck late. Mrs. Hanley. Wanted corner booth. Jamal covered double, then others. June 14. Calvin told Leon to wait outside again. Rain. Driver, upset. Calvin said, mark him aggressive if he complains. August 2. Young woman applied for host. Tasha. Calvin said not front room material. I hate myself for writing this and doing nothing. October 19. Black couple asked for window table. Calvin said reserved. It was not. Claire stopped reading aloud. The room was silent. Margaret pressed a napkin against her mouth. I didn't plan to show anyone. Then yesterday, when that child stood there with her papers torn, I thought, God help me. I have been saving evidence for a day I hoped would never come. Annie sat down across from her. The anger she had felt toward Margaret was still there, but it had changed again. The notebooks did not erase the silence. They explained its shape, and quote, they are very primed. Margaret was still there. Why didn't you send them? Annie asked. Margaret did not defend herself, because I was afraid he'd find out, because I needed my job, because I told myself no one would believe an old waitress with sore knees and no lawyer, because fear gets easier the longer you practice it. Jamal looked away. Richard spoke quietly. And now? Margaret lifted her head. Now I'm more afraid of dying with these still in my closet. No one had an easy answer for that. Claire closed the notebook. These will be preserved. We'll copy them and return the originals if possible. No, Margaret said. Keep them as long as needed. Annie looked toward the painted words above the counter. Hospitality is our tradition. Yesterday, they had sounded false. Today, they sounded like an accusation waiting to become a promise. A knock came at the front door. Everyone turned. Outside stood a black man in a delivery jacket, holding his phone in one hand and his cap in the other. He looked uncertain, as if he expected to be sent around back even now. Jamal said, That's Leon. Claire stood. Let him in. The busboy unlocked the door. Leon stepped inside slowly, eyes moving across the room. I got the number from the statement, he said. I don't want trouble. I just wanted to say it wasn't only me. His gaze landed on Annie. You the girl from the video? Annie nodded. Leon's face softened. I'm sorry that happened to you. She looked at the notebooks on the table, then at him. I'm starting to understand it happened to more than me. Leon gave a tired laugh. That's one way to put it. Richard offered him a chair. Leon looked surprised. I'm working. Delivery app doesn't pay me to sit. Richard said, Today, you are being paid to tell the truth. Claire, make sure he's compensated for his time. Leon stared at him, then sat down. For the first time since the clip had gone online, Annie felt the story turn away from her face and toward the thing underneath it. The rag had opened the door. Now the people who had been left outside were beginning to walk in. Leon sat at the table with his delivery bag resting against his leg, still looking ready to leave if someone raised their voice. Claire placed a recorder on the table, then looked at him before turning it on. Only with your permission. Leon glanced at Richard, then at Annie. This won't get me kicked off the app? No, Claire said. And if anyone retaliates against you because of what you say here, I want to know immediately. Leon gave a short nod. All right. Claire started the recorder. Please state your name. Leon Harris. And your connection to Harbor Light Grill? I deliver from here, or I used to. Maybe twice a week, sometimes more. Depends on orders. When did the issue begin? Leon looked at the tabletop. First time? About a year ago. Maybe longer. I came in through the front like everybody else. Pickup shelf was right there by the counter. Calvin told me drivers used the side door. Jamal leaned against the counter, arms folded. White drivers didn't. Leon looked at him. No, they did not. Claire made a note. Did you ask why? Leon gave her a tired look. Ma'am, I knew why. But yes, I asked once. He said front of house had to stay clean and orderly. Said delivery bags made the place look cheap. Annie thought of her old sneakers. Cheap. That word seemed to follow people Calvin wanted to shrink. Leon continued. One night it was raining hard. I'm talking sheets. The order wasn't ready, so I stood by the back door under that little strip of roof. Water running down my neck. I called inside after 10 minutes. A girl answered and said she'd check. Calvin came to the door and told me if I kept bothering staff, he'd report me as aggressive. Did he? Claire asked. Yes. That night, app froze my account for 2 days while they reviewed it. 2 days doesn't sound like much unless you pay rent by the order. Richard's face tightened. Were you compensated? Leon almost laughed. By who? Richard looked at Claire. Put him on the list. Leon shifted. I didn't come here for money. I know, Richard said. That is why it matters. Margaret sat very still, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. I wrote that night down. Leon turned toward her. I should have done more, she said. He studied her for a moment, then looked away. A lot of people should have. Margaret accepted it without defending herself. Yes. Claire let the silence breathe before asking, were there other drivers? Leon nodded. A man named Darnell. Woman named Keisha. Calvin made her wait outside with 2 catering bags while he chatted with a customer about golf. She cried in her car after. I saw her. Annie looked down at her hands. Claire wrote each name carefully. Can you contact them? I can try, only if you're comfortable. We can also go through the delivery platforms. Leon looked at Annie. When I saw that clip this morning, I knew that rag. Annie lifted her eyes. What do you mean? I don't mean the same rag. I mean the feeling. Somebody tossing disrespect at your feet and waiting to see if you'll pick it up. No one spoke. Richard looked toward the front windows, where reporters still waited across the street. That is what this has been for too many people. The bell at the side entrance sounded. Claire's assistant opened it, and 2 more people entered. A woman in navy scrubs and a man in a work jacket with paint on one sleeve. They both looked unsure until they saw Leon. The woman said, You Leon? Yeah. I'm Keisha. The man lifted his chin. Darnell. Leon looked at Claire. Guess they saw the statement too. Within an hour, Harbor Light Grill had become something between an office, a waiting room, and a confession booth. Claire's team set up at 3 tables. People came through the side door one by one. Drivers, former servers, a hostess named Tasha Bell with a neat bob and tired eyes, a dishwasher who had left 6 months earlier, a retired couple who remembered being told no window tables were available, while empty ones sat in the sun. No one told the same story, but every story carried the same shape. A door they were told not to use, a table they were told was unavailable, a shift they were never given, a complaint that vanished, a tone that changed depending on who was listening. Annie listened until the stories began to blur. She had thought pain would make her feel connected to them. Instead, it made her angry in a way that sat low and steady. What had happened to her was not an accident. It was a pattern that had been waiting for someone with enough protection to survive being believed. Tasha Bell sat across from Claire with a paper cup of coffee she had not touched. I applied for host because I'd done it before. 2 years at another restaurant. Good references. Calvin said he'd call. Margaret told me later he hired a girl with no experience. Margaret closed her eyes. Tasha looked at her. I'm not mad at you for telling me. I'm mad you had to whisper it in the parking lot like the truth was contraband. Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her face. You're right. Tasha turned to Annie. When I saw your clip, I thought, there it is. That little look he gets. Like he owns the air you're standing in. Annie gave a small nod. Yes, Richard had been quiet for most of the interviews. He stood near the counter, listening, occasionally asking Claire to add a name or preserve a record. His anger did not show loudly. It showed in the fact that he did not leave. It showed in every call he refused to rush, every person he thanked by name, every time he told someone their wages or time would be covered. Around noon, Claire took him aside near the front window. Annie saw them speaking and moved close enough to hear, not hiding it. Claire included her with a glance. We have enough for immediate termination. Richard looked toward the tables where former workers sat with coffee and old hurt. Do it. Calvin's counsel will fight. Let them. We also need to address Martin Leland. The emails tie him to suppression of complaints. Terminate access. Begin formal review. If legal confirms what we're seeing, he's gone. Claire nodded. There may be settlement exposure. Richard's mouth tightened. This is not a conversation about exposure. It's a conversation about repair. Claire accepted the correction. Understood. Annie watched him, unsure why that sentence moved her. Maybe because people with power often talked about damage as liability, as if harm only mattered when it cost money. Richard did not. Not today. A knock came from the front door this time. A reporter pressed a business card to the glass. Claire's assistant ignored it. Annie looked at the crowd across the street. They're not leaving. No, Richard said. They rarely do when a story smells like blood. Is that what this is? To some of them. And to you? He looked back at the people inside. A bill coming due. Before Annie could answer, Claire's phone rang. She listened, her expression going still. Send it to me. She ended the call and looked at Richard. Calvin released a statement through his attorney. The room seemed to sense it before anyone repeated the words. Claire read from her phone. Mr. Brooks denies any discriminatory intent. He states that the young woman entered Harbor Light Grill as part of a concealed ownership test. Orchestrated by Mr. Grill, Whitmore refused a reasonable workplace readiness task and escalated the situation when asked to assist with a minor spill. Annie felt the blood leave her face. Richard's voice was quiet. He accused her of setting him up. Yes, Leon muttered. Man's got nerve. Tasha said. That sounds like him. Claire continued. He also claims he did not know her race or family background would be used to destroy his reputation. Jamal laughed once, sharp and bitter. Didn't know her race? What, he thought she was invisible? Richard took the phone from Claire, read the statement, and handed it back. Release the full video to legal reviewers and the independent investigator. Not public yet. Annie looked at him. Why not public? Because once it's public, it belongs to everyone. I want you certain. She looked across the room. Leon, Tasha, Keisha, Darnell, Margaret, Jamal, Evelyn, David. All those people had already given pieces of themselves to the truth. Annie was tired of being careful while Calvin lied boldly. She turned to Claire. Can you blur the faces of the customers who didn't consent? Yes. Can you keep my full address and school private? Yes. Can the video include the part where the man says he spilled the water? Claire nodded. It should. And the part where Calvin changes his voice when my father walks in? Richard looked at her. Claire said, yes. Annie took a breath. Then release enough. Not everything. Enough that he doesn't get to call this a test. Claire waited. Are you sure? No, Annie said. But I'm sure I'm done letting him explain me. Richard's face softened with something like grief and respect. Then we do it your way. Claire began giving instructions. The room stirred, not with excitement, but with recognition. A line had been crossed. Calvin had tried to make the story about Annie's privilege to hide his own prejudice. Now the record would answer him. Evelyn came to stand beside Annie. You know people will still talk. I know. Some will be cruel. I know. And some will watch that video and remember the day they stayed quiet. Annie looked at her. Evelyn's voice lowered. That may be the part that changes something. By mid-afternoon, the edited video and a fuller statement were released. It showed David spilling the water. It showed Calvin throwing the rag, blocking Margaret, refusing Jamal, ignoring the truth, tearing the resume. It showed Richard entering and Calvin's voice changing. It did not show everything, but it showed enough. The response was immediate. Phones buzzed across the room as alerts appeared. Comments flooded in. Reporters shouted new questions through the glass. Former workers began receiving messages from people who believed them now, only because the world had seen a version of what they had lived. Annie did not watch the clip again. She stood near the counter, looking at the place where the rag had been. The floor was dry, clean, almost ordinary, but ordinary was gone. Claire came to her with a printed copy of the updated statement. At the bottom was the third-party hotline number for former employees, applicants, customers, and delivery workers. Annie read the final sentence aloud under her breath. Dignity should not depend on whether someone recognizes your last name. Leon, standing nearby, heard her. That line's going to stick. Annie folded the paper once. I hope it does more than stick. Outside, a reporter called her name. Richard stepped closer, waiting for her choice. Annie looked at the door, then at the people inside who had waited years for someone to listen. Not today, she said. Richard nodded and turned to Claire. No interviews. Annie stayed inside, away from the cameras. That was enough. The truth was already outside, moving faster than Calvin could chase it. For the first time since the rag hit the floor, Annie felt the story leave her hands without leaving her behind. By evening, Harbor Light Grill was no longer just a restaurant in Charleston. It had become a name people were saying in kitchens, break rooms, church parking lots, barbershops, and office elevators. The edited video spread faster than anyone at Whitmore Hospitality expected. It was not long, but it was clear. David Harlan's glass tipped. Water hit the tile. Calvin Brooks grabbed the rag and threw it at Annie's feet. Margaret moved to help and was stopped. Jamal offered to mop and was ordered back. Calvin tore the resume. Then Richard Whitmore stepped in, and Calvin's voice changed so quickly that people did not need a caption to understand the point. By 6 o'clock, local news had the story. By 8, national accounts had clipped Annie's sentence from the statement and set it beside the video. Dignity should not depend on whether someone recognizes your last name. Annie watched none of it at first. She sat in the back office of Harbor Light with a paper cup of sweet tea going watery in her hand while Claire's team worked around her. Richard had asked twice if she wanted to go home. Both times she had said not yet. She did not want cameras, but she also did not want to run, so she stayed behind the closed doors, listening to the low murmur of interviews and the buzz of phones from the dining room. Jamal came to the office doorway near 7. You hungry? He asked. Annie looked up. Not really. That usually means yes, but your stomach hasn't been consulted. She almost smiled. Maybe? He held up a paper plate covered with foil. Kitchen's closed, but not dead. I made biscuits this morning before everything went sideways. Heated one up. There's ham in it. Nothing fancy. Annie accepted it. Thank you. Jamal leaned against the doorframe. My daughter saw the video. Anya froze. I'm sorry. She's 13, knows more than I wish she did. He looked toward the dining room. She asked why nobody stopped him faster. Annie did not know what to say. I told her grown folks get scared too, Jamal said. Then she asked if scared is a good enough reason. And what did you say? He gave a tired breath. I said no. Not forever. Annie looked down at the biscuit in her hands. Jamal's voice softened. I owe you an apology. You offered to help. After I waited, so did a lot of people. That doesn't make it right. No, Annie said, but it makes it honest that you can say it. He nodded, accepting only what she offered and not asking for more. When this place opens again, if it opens right, I want my daughter to be able to walk in the front door and not have to measure the room first. Annie looked at him. That's what I want too. After he left, Richard came in with Claire. The day had worn on both of them. Claire's hair was still neat, but her eyes looked tired. Richard had removed his tie and folded it into his jacket pocket, which meant he had crossed from business mode into father mode, though he was still trying to hide it. Claire set a folder on the desk. The response is growing. The hotline has already received 37 submissions. Annie blinked. 37? Some are about Harbor Light. Some are about other restaurants in the newly acquired group. Some are from people who say the same kind of thing happened elsewhere. Richard's face tightened. Elsewhere in our group? Newly acquired. Yes. We don't know yet how much is connected, but we have to treat it seriously. Annie looked at him. So it wasn't just this place. Claire answered carefully. We don't know that yet, Richard said, but we know enough not to assume it was isolated. Annie set the biscuit down. The day was getting larger again, and she was tired of discovering new rooms inside the same wound. Claire seemed to notice. You do not have to carry the company's failures, Annie. No one keeps letting me forget I'm part of why they're visible. Richard sat across from her. Visible is not the same as responsible. I know, but you don't feel it. No. He nodded once. Then we'll keep saying it until you do. Claire opened the folder. There is another issue. Calvin's attorney is pushing the idea that Richard staged this to justify removing existing management after the purchase. Annie stared. That doesn't even make sense. It doesn't have to make sense to create doubt, Claire said. He is trying to turn a witnessed act into a corporate power move. Richard's voice went flat. Respond with the timeline. Annie arrived before I did. The water was spilled by a customer. Witnesses confirm. Security confirms. Calvin's own conduct confirms. We will, Claire said, but there's something else that may help. Margaret's notebooks show complaints predating the acquisition by years. Leon's platform record shows the aggressive report. Tasha still has the email rejection time-stamped after being told they would call her. Annie looked toward the dining room. Will they have to go public? Only if they choose, Claire said. Private testimony is enough for the investigation. Public pressure is separate. Richard leaned back. Public pressure is loud. Repair is quieter. Annie looked at him, but sometimes loud is why quiet repair finally starts. He met her eyes. You're right. The admission surprised her. Claire's phone buzzed. She read the message, then looked at Richard. The board wants a call tonight. Richard's mouth tightened. Of course they do. They're concerned about brand damage. Annie looked down with a bitter smile. Richard noticed. Claire, tell them the phrase they are looking for is human damage. Brand comes later. Claire's face barely changed, but Annie saw approval there. I'll quote you. Please do. By 9, the remaining witnesses had gone home. Leon left with a printed contact sheet and compensation for the time he had lost. Tasha walked out with Carol Whitaker's arm around her shoulder, though they had been strangers that morning. Evelyn stayed until her daughter arrived to drive her home. Before leaving, the old teacher stopped beside Annie. Child, when this gets loud tonight, don't confuse noise with truth. Annie nodded. I'll try. And eat something besides that biscuit. I'll try that too. Evelyn smiled. Good. One battle at a time. When she was gone, the restaurant felt hollow. Claire's staff packed laptops and evidence cases. The gray folder, Margaret's notebooks, the sealed rag, digital copies of video, and printed statements were logged and carried out through the side entrance. Annie stood near the counter. The place where the rag had landed looked clean now. Too clean, almost. She could still see it anyway. Richard came beside her. Ready? Almost. He waited. She walked to the wall beneath the painted words. Hospitality is our tradition. The phrase had watched all of it. The lie, the fear, the truth, the witnesses, the evidence. Annie touched the wall lightly, not the words themselves, just the painted wood beneath them. This needs to come down, she said. Richard looked at the sign. Maybe. Maybe? Or maybe it stays until the people here earn it. She thought about that. Words shouldn't get to hide just because people failed them, he said. Annie glanced at him. That sounds like one of your boardroom lines. It was better than most of my boardroom lines. She smiled faintly, then turned serious. If it stays, something else has to go beside it. What? She did not know yet. Not exactly. Only that the restaurant needed more than a promise painted years ago by people who had not protected anyone. Something about dignity, she said. Richard nodded. Then we'll make room for it. Outside, reporters still waited, though fewer now. Their cameras lifted as Richard and Annie stepped out the side door. Claire moved ahead, blocking questions with a calm, no comment tonight. Richard opened the car door, but Annie paused before getting in. A reporter called, Annie, do you believe Calvin Brooks is racist? The question struck the alley wall and hung there. Richard's posture changed, but Annie lifted one hand slightly, asking him not to answer for her. She turned just enough for the cameras to catch her profile. I believe people show who they are when they think someone has no power, she said. Then she got into the car. Richard closed the door gently. By the time they reached home, her words were already online too. The next morning, Richard Whitmore stood before a conference room full of people who were used to discussing problems in careful language. Brand risk, public perception, operational disruption, legal exposure. He let them talk for 7 minutes. Annie sat at the far end of the table, not because anyone had asked her to, but because Richard had. Claire sat beside her with a stack of printed reports, witness summaries, and the first list of names from the hotline. On the screen at the front of the room was a still image from the video. Calvin's shoe near the rag, Annie standing back from it, the water shining on the floor. A board member named Peter Langford cleared his throat. Richard, no one is minimizing what happened, but closing Harbor Light for 2 weeks sends a message that the location is fundamentally unsafe. Richard looked at him. It was. Peter shifted. I mean from a business standpoint. So do I. The room quieted. Another executive, a woman from communications, leaned forward. The public response is moving quickly. If we announce a full closure, paid staff leave, independent review, and possible settlements, we need to be prepared for questions about how widespread this is. Claire opened her folder. It is widespread enough that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Peter frowned. We don't know that yet. Claire slid several pages across the table. We have 9 handwritten records from Mrs. Ellis, 5 formal complaints found in Calvin Brooks's office, 2 delivery platform disputes, 3 former employee statements, and 37 hotline submissions in the first 24 hours. We do not know the full scope, but we know this is not one bad afternoon. Annie kept her eyes on the table. One bad afternoon. She hated that phrase already. It sounded like the weather had turned ugly, not people. Richard turned toward her. Annie. She looked up. You don't have to speak. I know. He waited. Annie looked at the executives around the table. Some looked sympathetic. Some looked worried. A few looked like they wished she had not come. That video is going to make people angry, she said. But if all you do is fire Calvin and wait for the anger to pass, then nothing changes. The next Calvin just learns to be quieter. No one interrupted. She continued. He didn't throw that rag because he was having a bad day. He threw it because he thought the room would let him. And for a while, it did. The communications woman lowered her eyes. Richard looked back at the board. Harbor Light closes for 2 weeks. Staff are paid. Every employee is interviewed by an independent team. Former employees, applicants, customers, and delivery workers get a third-party reporting line. Calvin Brooks is terminated for cause, pending final legal review. Martin Leland remains suspended while we complete the investigation into suppressed complaints. Peter opened his mouth. Richard raised one hand. I'm not finished. Peter closed it. We will audit every restaurant in the newly acquired group, not with a slideshow, not with a memo about values. Real review, hiring practices, complaint handling, delivery pickup policies, scheduling, wage equity, customer seating complaints, surveillance, retention. If a manager cannot explain how they treat people with no power, they do not manage for us. Claire made a note, though Annie knew she already had most of it written. Peter sighed. That will be expensive. Richard looked at him. So was the acquisition. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. You're asking what dignity costs when it is added after the fact. The sentence landed hard enough that no one reached for their coffee. Annie looked at Richard and saw something different in him. Not anger. Not only anger. Resolve with grief under it. He had bought a chain of restaurants and discovered rot in the walls. Now he was choosing to tear them open while everyone watched. The communications woman spoke carefully. We should also consider a public-facing commitment, something visible in the restaurant when it reopens. Annie thought of the painted words above the counter. Hospitality is our tradition. They already have words on the wall, she said. Richard turned to her. And? They weren't enough. No, if you put up something new, don't make it sound like advertising. What should it sound like? Annie thought about Leon at the table, Tasha in the parking lot, Margaret's notebooks, Jamal's daughter asking if fear was a good enough reason. Like a rule, she said, not a slogan. Claire wrote that down. After the meeting, the decisions moved fast. Calvin Brooks received formal termination notice before noon. Martin Leland's access remained locked while legal reviewed the emails. Harbor Light staff were called one by one and told the restaurant would close for 2 weeks, with pay, while the company conducted interviews and retraining. Some cried from relief. Some were afraid. A dishwasher asked whether he had done something wrong. A weekend hostess asked if Calvin could come back. Jamal answered calls from kitchen staff who trusted him more than corporate. Margaret came in to help build a list of people who needed to be contacted, her notebooks open beside her like pennants. By afternoon, a white sign replaced the handwritten closed notice on Harbor Light's front door. Harbor Light Grill is temporarily closed for independent review, staff support, and operational retraining. Employees will be paid during this closure. If you have experienced or witnessed mistreatment connected to this location, please contact the independent review line below. People stopped to read it. Some took pictures. A few nodded. One man shook his head and muttered that nobody wanted to work anymore. Evelyn Parker, who happened to be passing with her daughter, looked at him and said, "Some people just don't like it when work stops looking like obedience." He did not answer. The first training session happened 3 days later in a rented community hall, not inside the restaurant. Richard insisted on that. Harbor Light was still too raw. People needed chairs that did not remind them where they had been afraid. Annie did not plan to attend, but Jamal invited her. "You don't have to say anything," he told her on the phone, "but some folks want to see you're all right. I'm not sure I am." That's honest enough. Richard drove her, but she went inside alone. The hall smelled like coffee, paper, and floor polish. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle instead of rows. A facilitator named Dr. Elaine Mercer stood at the front, a black woman in her 60s with silver locks and the calm of someone who had heard every excuse and outlived most of them. She began without a slide deck. "Before we talk about service," Dr. Mercer said, "we are going to talk about power. Because service without dignity is just performance." The room was quiet. Margaret sat with her hands folded. Jamal leaned forward, elbows on knees. The young busboy from the day of the incident sat near the back, twisting a pen between his fingers. Several staff members Annie had never met watched her with uncertainty. Not resentment exactly, but the discomfort people feel around someone whose pain has forced their own life to change. Dr. Mercer looked around the circle. "No one here is being asked to perform guilt. Guilt can be selfish. It wants relief. Responsibility wants repair." Annie wrote that sentence down on the back of Carol Whitaker's card. During a break, Margaret approached her. "I've been thinking about what you said," Margaret said. "About wishing someone had stopped him before your papers were torn." Annie nodded. "I can't undo that." "No, but I asked Claire if I could help with applicant intake when we reopen. Not make decisions, just make sure every person who walks in gets the same form, the same greeting, the same chance." Annie looked at her. That would matter. Margaret's eyes filled, but she held herself together. "I want to be brave before it becomes urgent next time." That's a good way to put it. It's Dr. Mercer's way. I'm borrowing. Annie almost smiled. Borrowing is fine if you use it. Across the room, Jamal was talking with 2 kitchen workers. He caught Annie's eye and lifted his coffee cup in a small salute. Later that week, Richard took Annie back to the closed restaurant. No reporters waited this time. The public had moved on to new arguments, though the hotline had not slowed. Inside, ladders stood near the front wall. The old painted phrase remained above the counter, but beneath it workers had marked a place for a brass plaque. Claire handed Annie a proof. "Dignity is not reserved for paying customers. It belongs to everyone who walks through this door." Annie read it twice. "It's good," she said. Richard watched her. "Good enough? It's not enough by itself." "No, but it belongs there. We'll put another line near the counter," Claire said, handing her a smaller proof. "Clean the floor when water spills. Clean the system when cruelty does." Annie stared at that one longer. "That sounds like the truth," she said. Richard nodded to Claire. "Then that's the one." The plaque was installed the next morning. No ceremony. No cameras. Just a worker with a level, a drill, and 2 brass screws. Annie stood beside Richard while it went up. When the drill stopped, the restaurant felt different, though nothing important had been proven yet. A plaque could not interview an applicant. It could not stop a manager from lying. It could not make a frightened employee brave, but it could make silence a little harder. Richard looked at her. "You still want to look for a job?" It was not a question. "Yes. Palmetto Books? Maybe. Want me to call?" She gave him a look. He raised both hands. "Kidding. No, you weren't." "No," he admitted. "I wasn't." Annie folded Carol's card between her fingers. "I'll call myself." Richard smiled faintly. "I know." That afternoon, Annie sat on the back steps of the Whitmore house with her phone in one hand and Carol's card in the other. She dialed the number for Palmetto Books before she could overthink it. A woman answered. "Palmetto Books. This is Rachel." Annie took a breath. "Good afternoon. My name is Annie Whitmore. Carol Whitaker said you might be hiring part-time." There was a pause. "Oh," Rachel said. "Aunt Carol did mention you. Are you still interested after everything?" Annie looked out at the oak trees. The world had not become safe overnight. It probably never would. "Yes," she said. "I'm still interested. Can you come in tomorrow around 10? Annie smiled, small and steady. "Yes, ma'am, I can." When she hung up, Richard was standing inside the kitchen doorway pretending not to listen. She looked over her shoulder. "Tomorrow at 10. He nodded. "Need a ride?" "No." "Bus?" "Yes." He breathed in like the answer hurt but nodded again. "Text me when you arrive." That's one clause. A small one. She stood, tucked the card into her pocket, and walked past him into the house. On her desk upstairs, the torn resume still lay beside the graduation pen. She did not throw it away. Instead, she printed a new one and placed it in a clean folder. The old one would stay where it was, not as a wound, but as a record. The first door had not opened, so she would knock on another. The next morning, Annie took the bus to Palmetto Books. Richard did not argue. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee while she walked down the driveway in the same denim jacket, carrying a clean folder with her new resume inside. He had offered nothing more than, "Text me when you get there," and she had answered, "I will." That was progress for both of them. Palmetto Books sat on Meeting Street between a florist and a small shop that sold postcards, candles, and jars of peach preserves to tourists. It was not grand. The front window held a stack of local history books, a handwritten staff pick sign, and a bowl of butterscotch candies near the register. When Annie opened the door, a small bell rang. A woman in her 30s looked up from behind the counter. "Annie?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm Rachel. Aunt Carol told me you might come by." Rachel smiled. Not too wide, not with pity. "She also told me not to embarrass you by acting like I already know you." Annie relaxed a little. "She sounds thorough. She is a retired nurse." Thorough is the polite word. Rachel nodded toward a small table by the window. "Come sit. We'll talk like normal people." The interview lasted 20 minutes. Rachel asked about Annie's school plans, availability, comfort with customers, shelving, inventory, the register. She did not mention Harbor Light until the end. "I saw the video," Rachel said. Annie's fingers tightened on the folder. Rachel kept her voice even. "I'm not bringing it up to make you explain it. I only want you to know nobody here will ask you to be grateful for basic respect." Annie looked at her. Rachel added, "We do ask people to alphabetize correctly. That is non-negotiable." Annie laughed before she could stop herself. Rachel hired her for Saturdays and 2 weekday afternoons. The first paycheck came 2 weeks later. It was not much. After taxes, it was smaller than Annie expected and larger than she could explain. She held the check in the break room, staring at her name printed cleanly across the top, Annie Whitmore. Not torn, not split, not questioned. When she brought it home, Richard was in the kitchen reading a report from Claire. Harbor Light was scheduled to reopen the next day. Annie placed the check on the island. He looked at it, then at her. "May I?" She nodded. Richard picked it up with both hands, as if it were fragile. "Your first paycheck. It's not exactly a fortune." "No," he said. "It's better." She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "You're impossible. I'm proud." "I know." "Good. I would hate to be subtle and fail." She leaned against the counter. "Harbor Light opens tomorrow?" "Yes." "How bad was it?" "The investigation." Richard set the check down gently. "Bad enough. Calvin is gone. Martin Leland is gone. 3 former employees accepted settlements. Delivery drivers are being compensated. Hiring policies changed. Complaint reviews now go outside management. Claire is still auditing the other locations. And Margaret? She stayed. She's helping train applicant intake. Jamal? Promoted. Kitchen lead for evening operations. Annie nodded. "Good." Richard watched her. "Do you want to go tomorrow?" She had known he would ask. "Not opening day." "All right, but soon." 3 months later, soon finally arrived. Charleston was warm, with sunlight lying across the sidewalks and the slow traffic of a Saturday afternoon moving past the old storefronts. Annie and Richard walked to Harbor Light Grill from a parking spot around the corner. She wore her denim jacket again, Not as a disguise this time, just because she liked it. Her sneakers were still scuffed. She had not replaced them. The green awning was the same. The brass sign was polished. The windows were clean. But there was a new feeling before they even reached the door. A delivery driver stood near the front pickup shelf with a cup of ice water in his hand, talking with a hostess who was checking an order. No one had sent him to the alley. Annie noticed. So did Richard. He did not say anything. She appreciated that. The bell rang when they entered. A young host looked up and smiled. "Good afternoon." "Table for two?" Annie waited for the pause. The glance down. The calculation. It did not come. Richard said, "Counter, if you have room." "Of course, sir. Right this way." They followed him past the front wall. The old painted words were still there. "Hospitality is our tradition." Beneath them, fixed to the wood with brass screws, was the new plaque. "Dignity is not reserved for paying customers. It belongs to everyone who walks through this door." Annie stopped. People moved around her. Plates clinked. Coffee poured. A child asked for more fries. Someone near the window laughed. The restaurant was alive again. Not perfect, not magically healed, but different in ways that could be seen. Richard stood beside her. "Is it all right?" She read the plaque again. "It's a start." That's what Claire said. Claire is usually right. Unfortunately, Annie smiled. Margaret came from behind the counter carrying a pot of coffee. She saw Annie and froze for half a second, then smiled with relief and nerves mixed together. "Annie," she said. "Mr. Whitmore." "Margaret," Richard said. Annie looked at her name tag. Margaret Ellis, guest services lead. Margaret noticed. "Sounds fancier than it is." "What do you do?" Annie asked. "Make sure people get greeted properly. Make sure applicants get forms. Make sure delivery drivers don't have to beg for water. And when somebody new starts, I tell them the truth about why that plaque is there." Annie looked at her. "The truth?" Margaret nodded. "Not a polished version." That mattered. Jamal appeared at the pass-through window. "I knew I smelled billionaires." Richard looked offended. Singular. Jamal grinned. "For now." Annie laughed. It surprised her how good the sound felt in that room. Jamal set 2 plates on the counter. "Apple pie. On the house." Richard raised an eyebrow. Jamal corrected himself. "On me. Different thing. Claire made us take a whole training section on that." "Then thank you," Richard said. They sat at the counter. The coffee was hot. The pie was warm. The room carried ordinary noise again, but not the same silence. Annie watched a young woman enter with a folder under her arm. The host greeted her, asked her name, offered her a seat, and brought an application on a clipboard. No one made a show of it. That was what made it powerful. Annie looked down the counter and saw the smaller sign near the register. "Clean the floor when water spills. Clean the system when cruelty does." Her throat tightened, but not in the same way as before. Richard saw her reading it. "Too much?" "No," she said. "Just enough." A delivery driver came in then, a black man with a red insulated bag. The hostess smiled. "Pick up for Carter?" "That's me." "It'll be 2 minutes. You want water while you wait?" He blinked, then nodded. "Sure, thanks." Annie watched him take the cup. Richard leaned closer. "You all right?" She thought about the rag, the torn resume, the clip, the comments, the notebooks, the people who came through the side door to tell stories they had carried too long. She thought about her first paycheck folded in the top drawer of her desk, beside the old torn resume she still had not taped together. "I'm getting there," she said. Richard nodded. "That is an honest destination." She looked at him. "You make that sound like a boardroom line." "It is better than most of my boardroom lines." They ate in peace for a while. When they finished, Richard left cash on the counter. Annie noticed it was exact payment, plus a fair tip, not the kind of extravagant gesture that turned a meal into a performance. He was learning too. As they stood to leave, Margaret came around the counter. "I want you to know something," she said to Annie. "Every new hire hears the story now. Not your private life, not your father. The story of the rag, the resume, and the room that waited too long to speak." Annie looked at her. "And what do you tell them?" Margaret's eyes shone, but her voice held. "That if they see someone being made small, they don't wait for the owner to walk in." Annie felt the words settle. "Good," she said. Outside, the late afternoon light touched the brass sign by the door. Richard and Annie walked side by side toward the corner. He did not lead. She did not follow. At the crosswalk, he asked, "Still working at the bookstore?" "Yes." "Still taking the bus?" "Yes." He sighed, but it was mostly habit now. "Text me when you get there." "I always do." The light changed. Before they crossed, Annie looked back once at Harbor Light Grill. Through the window, she could see the counter, the host stand, the plaque, Margaret pouring coffee, Jamal handing a plate through the pass, the delivery driver waiting near the pickup shelf like he belonged there because he did. The place was not redeemed by a sign. Annie knew that. Redemption was not a thing you installed with screws. It was something people had to choose every day, especially when no one important was watching. But the door opened, and a woman walked in with a little boy holding her hand. The host smiled at both of them. That was a beginning. Annie turned back to the street. Richard waited beside her. Together, they crossed. The lesson of this story is that dignity should never depend on money, clothing, skin color, or a powerful last name. People reveal their true character by how they treat someone they believe has no power. Annie's courage reminds us that standing up for yourself is not disrespect. Sometimes it is the first step toward justice. The story also teaches that silence can protect cruelty, but one honest voice, one witness, or one act of courage can begin to change an entire system. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.